Alrighty, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to American Orthodoxy. I'm your host, as always, Benjamin Michael. I've got a great show for you today, as we are going to be reacting to Jay's debate with Jake, the Muslim metaphysician. I say metaphysician because every time he does a debate on metaphysics, he gets absolutely shredded. I don't know if you guys saw his debate with Fearless Truth, my boy Nick, but Nick absolutely embarrassed him, absolutely dog-walked him on the Trinity, literally put up a formal logical sequence, and Jake pretended to know how to read it, literally didn't even know how to read it. He doesn't understand basic logic, but he calls himself a metaphysician. So Jake and Jay debated on the Trinity, maybe like, 2 years ago now? It's been a minute. But this debate particularly was on the society, the Muslim societies, whether or not Muslim societies are better or worse than Christian societies. And so we're going to be reacting to this debate. I do have to address a few things. So there was some drama again on Instagram with this Monique chick, who played a clip of me talking about the woman I'm married to, where I said that I'm married to an old stock American white woman, and she found this offensive for some reason. I don't know if you guys are aware, or I guess she's not aware of this. I wasn't actually going to show this, but I'm going to now. So a old stock American is it is literally a common term. Old stock American, also known as colonial stock, founding stock, heritage Americans, or pioneer stock, is a colloquial name. Oh, here, let me share screen here. Is a colloquial name for Americans who are descended from the original settlers of the 13 colonies. Historically, old stock Americans have been mainly Protestants from northwestern Europe, whose ancestors immigrated to British America in the 17th and 18th centuries. This is my wife's family, guys. My wife is a old stock American, and there was some dumbass in the comments saying, "Why are we comparing women to livestock?" And then calling me retarded. They said, "I know you're not this retarded." Like, bro, all you have to do is Google this. All you have to do is Google this and see that I am correct about the usage of the term. It is a very common term. By the way, can you guys hear me? I want to make sure everything's good here. But anyways, so this Monique chick continues to attack me. Also in the clip, I said, I'm not Jewish, I'm Aryan, which again, why is this problematic? I don't understand why it's problematic. This woman is allergic to white people. She just absolutely hates white people. She actually said it's inherently racist to want to preserve white American culture. So is it also inherently racist to want to preserve black American culture? Is that also inherently racist, Monique? She goes, "Oh, and I don't hate white people because my husband is half white." Isn't that what they make fun of us for? First of all, half white. I don't know how to tell you this, but there's no such thing as half white. I mean, maybe to an extent there is, but generally speaking, what's the other half too? Because sure, if you're, if your parents are, one is white, one is Hispanic, you're actually 75% white in that case, right? Because the Hispanics are already half Spanish. But yeah, anyways, yeah, I hate to see a white boy with motion. The funniest part about it, guys, was she was literally using this as an example of why women are being scared away from the church. So her justification for why women don't want to join the Orthodox Church, which is also false, by the way, because many women are now joining the church. They're following suit with a lot of the men who are joining, right? And that's happening by men converting Protestant women, which, by the way, I encourage you guys to convert Protestant women. That's how to do it. You should be out there converting Protestant women, right? My wife was a Protestant. We were Protestants together and we converted together, right? She was Baptist. I was sort of non-denominational, and then I was Presbyterian. So anyways, all this to say, guys, This was her justification for why women are supposedly afraid of the church. Oh, I'm glad my thing is working again, where I can show comments on the screen. For some reason, that wasn't working on Tuesday. So clearly, she was way more offended than my wife for me describing literally what my wife is. Somehow there was people that interpreted that as livestock. I don't know why that went to. I don't know why your mind went to livestock. Why are you comparing my wife to livestock? It's kind of messed up, dude. I don't know why you would go there. But anyways, this was her justification for why we're supposedly scaring away women. By the way, her comments again, the 2 posts she's made about me, this woman has like 6,000 followers. The 2 posts she's made about me, both of them are flooded. I mean, just like flooded with comments, correcting her, saying she's lying about me, all kinds of things. Like, I think the first post had like 100 likes, 400 comments. The second post had like 50 likes, 150 comments. So this woman is out of control. I mean, she's about to give birth to a baby. She's, literally like, in her 3rd trimester, at the tail end of her 3rd trimester. And I told her in DMs, because she was DMing me, I was like, sister, like, you should focus on, you have a precious baby that is about to enter this world. You should focus on that, not attacking men online. Like, you are stressing yourself out. You're stressing your baby out. There is literally just no reason to do this. There's no reason to do this. And I'm pretty sure she already has children. You are a mother and a wife who is about to give birth, and you are attacking a random dude on the internet. Like, what the hell is wrong with you? Go be a wife and mother. Like, go be a wife and mother to your children who need you, to your husband who needs you. Why are you attacking me? Why are you in my DMs? I had to restrict her because she kept DMing me. I literally kept saying, all right, I'm done. Like, God bless. And she kept DMing me. So I had to restrict her. I'm about to block her. I'll have to block her at some point if she continues to DM me. I haven't even checked the restriction to see if she's DM'd me again. I'm sure she has. So that's a little weird. Why are you DMing me so much? Very strange behavior. And like, she was like in my DMs saying like the hard R, like calling herself that. Like, it was just very odd, very unhinged behavior. So anyways, all this to say, guys, that's what's going on over on Instagram. That's where all the fun happens. Man, my lips are chapped. But anyways, guys, let's get going on this debate, huh? So please like and subscribe. Please like and subscribe, guys. As always, go follow me on Instagram. I just went viral yesterday again on Instagram with a post about the Great Replacement theory, quote unquote, conspiracy theory. Guys, we're shutting down the white supremacist Great Replacement conspiracy theory. Can't have any of that white supremacist nonsense, So I refute it. I refute the anti-Semitic people saying that Israel is taking over Argentina. I refute those anti-Semites. I refute those anti-Semites that dare say that Israel is flooding Spain with migrants. Guys, it was a total coincidence that it happened on the same day that the Spanish banned the Jews from Spain. It was total coincidence, guys. It was like totally coincidence that Netanyahu's son was like out here giving plans to Muslim migrants on how to invade Spain. It was like totally coincidence that Benjamin Netanyahu said that they're going to pay an immediate price. Guys, it's like super all a coincidence. All right, we got to refute these anti-Semites. All right, there were these anti-Semites spreading this conspiracy theory about a rabbi who went to Iceland and then immediately started advocating for mass migration. Now, it's true that a rabbi went there and immediately started advocating for mass migration. It was like the first ever rabbi to go to Iceland, and he immediately started advocating for mass migration. Those are true facts, but these anti-Semites need to stop talking about it, okay? These anti-Semites are getting out of control, all right? You guys need to stop pointing out the facts, okay? All right? Oy vey. Oy vey. All right. Let's get going on the debate. But anyways, guys, so follow me on Instagram at RealBenMichael. My Twitter's cooking a little bit again. It's hard to run like more than two platforms at once. Usually, like right now, I'm running YouTube and Instagram the most. I've kind of fumbled the bag on Twitter. I'm not gonna lie, but I'm locking back in on Twitter because Twitter is where the magic happens. When you're here, your family. Here being Twitter. But anyways, so go ahead and follow me on. Oh, someone said that I put them onto For My Legionaries. By the way, guys, it's one N. It's one N. Everybody makes this mistake. All right. The way you just spelled it, there's like a disease that's named, that's that name. It's just one N. But anyways, it's a great book. Get For My Legionaries if you haven't. Shalom, shalom, everyone. Shalom, everyone. All right, let's dive in, guys. Let's lock in. We're gonna lock the freak in. You know what I'm saying? But I will say, we're gonna run it at 1.5 speed, and we'll see how it goes. If we got to drop it down to 1.25, we will. But we're gonna cook through this. We're gonna watch old Pope Dyer fry Jake, the quote-unquote Muslim metaphysician.
Do you think that your position is a minority view held amongst Christians today?
When Solomon has the two hoes, and he, does that wise thing where he tests the hose, and then he says, okay, now we know who the real mom is, right?
He mentioned about usury. I think that's a point we can agree on, and there's another party that, I don't know, sometimes we can't say their names, but I think they're largely responsible for that.
Nigerians?
What's that?
Nigerians?
Yeah, exactly.
He's applying the principle of the law to the 304s and the thoughts. T-H-O-T, that's Old Testament thought.
Special thanks to our sponsor, Maine First Project, fighting to put Mainers first. Check out mainfirstproject.org. Huge thanks to Revival of the Anointed's Rule, equipping Christians to fight for biblical values through policy. Jay Dyer.
By the way, guys, super glad that Sam Shamoon, every time I hear his name, I think of Sam Shamoon calling him Gay Crier, which is like so. There's also the OOs. They call him like Jay Dyer or something. It's like the most retarded, like you guys couldn't come up with something better. I feel like Gay Crier was the best one. Like, I feel like Jay's a good sport. I feel like he would agree that that's like the best one. But the OOs call him Jay Dyer, which I don't even know what that means. But anyways, I'm really glad to see him and Sam Shamoon back on good terms.
And returning to the stage, but before I do that, one really quick PSA is just to be sure to defend Islam's broader vision. One last thing, and this.
I'm the founder and CEO of Roar. I'll tell you, there's more Christians.
Indeed, we will. With Jay, your opening statement timer is set. I'll start it on your first word.
I noticed my friend here came in his pajamas, but so did I. I'm just kidding, Jake. Jay gave me his book. I looked through it. I'm already Muslim, so debate's over. I give up. He convinced me, dude. All right, what's up, Texas? It is Sunday, 2005. We're going to be live in the next 4 hours. That's how it sounds. All right, Deuteronomy 21. We're going to go back to an area that you probably wouldn't expect, because usually we think of civilization as this political philosophy, this idea, that, whatever. No, actually, Western civilization, our civilization, including the civilization that I'm going to harken back to, which is the model Christian civilization, in my view, Byzantium, the continuation of the Roman Empire. We're going to look at that, see how it was successful, and what ways.
By the way, guys, you guys know I love Jay. No one can deny the absolute just conversion throughput this man is responsible for. Generally speaking, I disagree a little bit with sort of the I agree with what he's saying about like a lot of the founding of America and the Masonic stuff. I would say, like, prefacing this before we get into this debate, because I know some clips, I think Jay is more inclined to throw the Western Christianity like paradigm under the bus than I am. I think I'm a little bit more sympathetic than he is. But other than that, like, Jay's the GOAT. You guys know I love Jay. And I think he's right about just about everything.
Christian imperium lasted as the longest.
But what I was going to say is I agree with this. What I love about this is something I talk about all the time, right? Is like using Byzantium as a prescription, right? Byzantium and Tsarist Russia, which I like Tsarist Russia even more because it's more modern, right? So it's a little bit more prevalent to the modern day, right? But Byzantium is a great example as well.
Civilization, and the most successful civilization in world history. If we go back to Deuteronomy and the Mosaic Law, we have laws of warfare. This is the first time, as far as we know, in ancient Near Eastern civilization, that laws were introduced that protected captives amongst the slave class or captives amongst war. These laws gave a new level of protection that underclass or that women or that others did not have prior to that. Prior to that, the typical attitude was that these were in a state of slavery. And so now we have a new introduction that the husband of these, in this situation, if he would like to marry, he must marry and give legal status to captives of warfare. The passage that is used here to protect these girls is the Hebrew word that signifies them as Isha, or young, that is, young girl. So here we have for the first time the protection of the youth in the ancient world through Mosaic law, Deuteronomy 21. This passage...
Interesting. I like that perspective, because Muslims will try to use that to say that these girls are being raped, which is not what the text says. Right? So basically Jay is saying, no, like they're being given legal status. That's actually what's happening.
And no other passage, this passage does not allow for rape. In fact, it forbids rape, and all other passages that discuss the possibility of rape are also explicit in condemnation in the Torah and in the Old Testament. In Numbers 31, which is a passage often cited by Muslims and others who critique this.
By the way, I give Jake a lot of credit. Like Jake, now part of it is that, you know, he's clearly a white dude, right? He's not one of these barbarian Muslims, and so he actually calls out guys like Libiano, right, who I think is Pakistani or something, low IQ, right? Like Jake has like the common etiquette, right, that is common in European cultures, right? Even though he's been Islamified, like personally, but he comes from that background, so he has those that value structure, right? And that really sets him apart, and allows him to have these actual discussions, unlike someone like Libiano, who's an absolute clown show, and who every time he gets in any debate, it's just a screaming match.
Something said about sexuality in this passage. In fact, the context is Numbers 25, that a Moabite or a Midianite person was to be not allowed in because of the previous warfare that the Israelites had engaged against them for enticing them to worship Baal and to commit orgies. But since these were not that generation, this next generation was to be protected, and you spared the virgins. They could then become members of the covenant community. You raised them, and then at a certain age, you could marry them. This did not allow for rape. In fact, rape is forbidden. Deuteronomy 21, 10-14. You are not allowed to defile the girls. And then later on, they are women in the Numbers and Deuteronomy passage. So in other words, it goes from young girls to, as they become older, they become members of the covenant community.
Great exegesis there by Jay.
They have certain legality and protection. Now, that is totally contrary to the typical attitude that we have amongst Muslim critics of the Old Testament, particularly the passages in Numbers and Deuteronomy. They're often cited. They're actually the opposite. They're the beginning of the protection of all classes of society. As we get into modern civilization, we look back to our precedents, our heritage. That is Roman law, that is common law, that is biblical law, that is canon law. All of these legal traditions have an important, crucial history when it comes to forming the society in the order that we have. Yes. Certainly, I do not agree with every aspect of postmodern or even post-Enlightenment society. The Enlightenment certainly had some good critiques of its previous papal civilization. But prior...
Oh, wow. Interesting. I'm a little bit surprised to hear Jay say that.
To that, there is the unknown imperium again of Byzantium. When the Christian church was founded, the Christian church was a tiny group that believed that it was the fulfillment of everything that Old Testament religion was pointing to. The Old Testament bequeathed to it not just the general law of the Ten Commandments, but many other principles, including the notion of not just civil law that's based...
Maybe I misinterpret Jay sometimes, like when he's shitting on the Enlightenment, shitting on America. I actually will say, I think, especially lately, I've noticed him much more inclined to praise America. Like when he went on John Hears actually brought me up and basically asked him this question. And Jay essentially said, like what I say, which is like, that there are like basically a lot of good things about America that we can preserve, right? Now there's a ton, everybody mishears me when I say this. They think that I'm like saying we can preserve it wholesale. Like, no, there's a lot of things that need to be baptized, right? But there's a lot of good things about America. There are, it's just true. And the fact that it was just purely Masonic and Jewish and deist or something is just utter nonsense. It's just not true. There was Masonic influence. There was Jewish influence. There was deist influence. But the vast majority of the Founding Fathers were confessional Protestants. Some of them were Catholics and Orthodox.
Around the deity. But also...
And most of them were not Masons. The majority of them were not Masons.
Canonical law or church law. Church law, for example, in the West began to give the accused rights. We might hear or think about the Inquisition. And although I don't agree with everything to do with the Roman Catholic Church, there's sometimes a bad attitude is given towards the Inquisition because we think of only the bad things. But actually one of the things that the Inquisition...
Wow. I'm not going to lie. Maybe I misinterpreted. Maybe my preface was bad because I saw some clips. where Jake basically uses this against him. Jake basically uses this against him as like Jay sort of like throwing the West under the bus, but he's already giving credence to certain aspects of Western Christianity. So I got to give Jay a lot of credit.
Introduced based on biblical principles was the
Maybe
idea
I
of the rights of the
misspoke.
accused.
Maybe Jay and I fully agree on this topic then. Maybe we fully agree on this topic. Maybe I just misinterpreted some of the things he said.
The idea of defense of the accused. So a lot of the great heritage that we have in Western tradition does come from, again, not just Christian civilization, not just biblical texts, but also many examples of the appropriation and application of those principles. It's not just the legal realm and the realm of duties and obligations, etc., or protecting those that might be a lower class. We also have the notion of universities, the notion of hospitals, the notion of advancements in technology, which no other civilization or society was able to achieve like we have achieved. Again, certainly we've gone off in a wrong direction. But to blame that on Christianity, as I suspect some will do, I don't know, is in fact false. In other words, we can look at many religious societies in Islamic countries who were formerly dedicated to the principles of Islam and also took a secularizing or a liberalizing journey. Interestingly, many of the countries that are Islamic that went in a secularizing, industrializing pathway actually became monetarily successful. Other countries remained and are noted by many of the features that I'm sure everybody remembers, the Andrew versus Daniel Hakikuchu debate. That's kind of a classic. That highlighted a lot of the moral failures and features of a lot of Islamic society. I'm not going to rehearse that debate. I think everybody remembers that. So you have that in kind of in your mind. I want to focus on the other aspects that I think are also crucial kill shots for the attempt at thinking that Islamic society is some goal or some beneficial, better position. When we talk about what's the good, or how do we judge between Christianity, it might be Orthodox Christianity being more advantageous to society versus Islam, I think we have to, first of all, think about what the good is. When we think about the type of deity that we have in Christianity, which is the focal point, right? We have, for example, the idea of the balance of the one and the many. Of course, Jake does not like the Trinity, but he has the same problem as we've highlighted in our previous debates, that when he tries to harmonize the 99 ontologies of Allah with the singular essence of Allah, he's got the same metaphysical problem. For us, we don't actually think that God being one and three is a problem. In fact, this becomes the pattern and the principle, not just for church governance with bishops and many people, also, though, for the governance of society. Many Orthodox theologians have pointed out that the idea of the imperium.
To the dear Romanian brother in the comments, not just Vlad and Codreanu, but also St. Stephen the Great. In fact, I discovered St. Stephen the Great through Codreanu. And I actually like St. Stephen the Great the most out of the three in some respects because he is a canonized saint. Some really cool stuff about St. Stephen the Great, by the way, guys. So he's basically Vlad the Impaler in saint form. He was less brutal, built a church every time he win a battle. He would fast for 3 days straight after every battle so that he wouldn't grow prideful. He is a hero in Romania, obviously, and he didn't die a humiliating death, the way that Vlad did. Now, Vlad was betrayed, but St. Stephen the Great was objectively a better warlord and was also a saint. So I love St. Stephen the Great.
Many nations united by one faith was the glue that held the greatest civilization together in history, namely Byzantium. Byzantium was founded around the Code of St. Justinian, one of the great emperor saints, and St. Justinian was noted for shutting down many of the pagan philosophical academies. When those academies were shut down, particularly the Platonic academies, they were able to apply Aristotelian principles, not in toto, but many Aristotelian practical philosophical principles to the Eastern Roman Imperium or Byzantium to again create the most successful empire in world history. We're talking about 1,000+ years of thriving and surviving. We're talking about the greatest monetary policy in world history until they begin to money clip. Okay, money clipping. I think you know what I'm talking about. Debasing the currency, right? And I think, again, that's just one ethical principle that we could think of. Christian society forbade usury prior to that. Now, granted, I think Islam would also agree with that. But the point here is that what actually began the unraveling of Byzantium was, in fact, the principles of monetary debasement, usury, and then opening the door to
basically
Islam.
Jews. Basically saying what deracinated the prosperity of Christian societies was Jews.
That led to the
anyone saying usury instead of interest, automatic dog whistle, bro. Automatic dog whistle.
Of Byzantium. Islam began to have what some have called a golden age, and this was what would characterize the rise of the Ottomans. Now, since the Ottoman decline, when the British Empire became the next successful world empire, the Islamic world has tended, I'm not saying that they all agree, but they've tended to speak of a decline and a desire to return to this golden age. And certainly we could say, well, Jay, don't you also think that there's a Byzantine golden age? I don't think that we can ever rebuild something from the past. The famous historian Oswald Spengler, philosopher of history, noted that you can never recreate a past civilization, but you can build on what is there, standing on the shoulders of giants. And so I would say that the key point that...
Love Oswald Spengler, by the way. We obviously went through his book in my group chat last month. Decline of the West, volume 1. There's also volume 2, which I have not read yet. So yeah, basically he talks about how the world is like it's a cycle. And he actually talks, it was interesting, there's an excerpt that I posted because he talks about actually what caused the Reformation. And it's really interesting, basically because he talks about, the development in the West and the causes of the Reformation. And I was able to sort of put 2 and 2 together as to why those things didn't happen in the Orthodox nations.
We have lost in the West is probably something that he and I would agree on. The transcendent, the idea that law and society do have to be arranged around the transcendental idea of a God or of a deity. However, if that deity is a deity that, as the Quran says in multiple places, that he is the greatest of deceivers, that's probably not going to be good for society. In Christianity, we have a different idea of who God is. God is not just a single Unitarian, unknowable deity, unlike anything in the world, but he is rather one of us in the sense of becoming incarnate. He's not only one of us, but he's immanent and he's transcendent. He also gives us practical living, practical ways to understand and to know and to love people.
So, Nat, that's true. Pre-Christian Rome and Greece did have advanced civilizations and infrastructure, but it was based on, still very much Christian principles. As far as the way they were tapping into natural law, and what you get to see really is the church fathers, glean from those philosophers, right, and really are able to build out Christian theology using that terminology and employing some of those systems. Right, so we can see there's a lot of overlap, and then we know from the saints that those philosophers were some of the first in Hades to repent, right, and accept Christ. Now, an example that's counter to what you said, it would be the Germanic barbarians, right? My ancestors, right, were Germanic barbarians, and then when they became Christianized, right, they became world powers and they became great civilizations, right? So, I think the Germanics are sort of an example that's contrary to the common sort of, I know that you're not really reinforcing this, but there's a common pagan sort of talking point that you don't need Christianity because look at Greece and Rome, which ironically, those are the same guys who shit on Southern Europe. And it's bro, Southern Europe carried the boats for 1,500 years before we really, carried on the legacy of, European civilization. So
love becomes a very crucial feature that is not really present in the Islamic ethos. I am not saying in some hippy-dippy sense that we base society upon just love, bro. No, I'm saying that we base it around what the Bible and the principles of the church say love is, which is the 10 Commandments, and which is to guard those who are the weak, those who are our children, those who are our progeny. But in Quran 4:24, which is a passage not abrogated, we have the statement that you may take those in captivity amongst the women, that which your right hand possesses. This is a very famous phrase. It's discussed many, many times by many Islamic scholars. And the hadiths also explain that what this means, and it has not been abrogated, is that in many cases you are obliged to marry, but in some cases, if it's a war captive, you can sex them up, right? That doesn't sound like the same ethic. It doesn't sound like the same deity. And remember, the passages in Deuteronomy 21 and Numbers 31 were not advocating for sexual license and grape with those captives. In fact, it is the opposite. You shall not sell her for money is in fact what it says. Now, how many? 30 seconds. And so what I think we want to see is that in the Islamic conception of God and society, it is a master-slave relationship. In the Christian conception of society, there is the honor and duty that we owe to God, and that forms the basis of the law in the society. And the church becomes that foundation. And in Islamic civilization, you'll find out that all of the great philosophy and the ideas are actually cribbed from the Greeks, which is actually part of Western civilization.
Thank you very much for that opening.
Bro does look like he's in pajamas, bro. Not
Jake will
gonna
give you the
lie.
same 12 and a half minutes. And
Guys, please like the live and subscribe. As always, I'll go over all super chats at the end. Please like the live and subscribe. Also do a members-only live stream, as I almost always do. So if you want to be a member and support me monthly, you can sign up for memberships.
the timer is set for you on your first word. I'll start it.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Okay. All right, thanks. I'm back here again, and I'm definitely outnumbered, as usual, but it's fine. I have no problem with it. I actually appreciate a lot of what Jay had to say regarding Christianity, but unfortunately, I don't think that the biblical text supports his position, and I don't think that many people in the audience would, but we'll see. Anyway, tonight's question is not which religion is true. Jay and I can debate that another night, and
I think he tries to pit Orthodoxy against like Protestant and Catholic. I think that's what he does in this debate.
Kind of debated that in another circumstance. Tonight's question is practical. Which faith is better for society? And Jay has already told us how to decide it. I'm going to quote some of the things from his previous videos. In his own lecture on this subject, he said the whole matter comes down to one thing, where there is, quote, a revealed doctrine of governance or not, whether there is or not. A revealed doctrine. I accept his standard completely, so hold both of us to it tonight. And let me propose how we measure the results. A society is doing well when families hold together, when its people are sober, when the poor are provided for, when children are actually born, and when the faith of their fathers actually reaches the sons. Family, sobriety, charity,
Yes, someone said that the Quran has a lot more in common with the Talmud. That's true, and I intend to do a full stream on this, by the way. I did a full stream on the Talmud, which if you guys want to watch that, I did a full stream on the teachings of the Talmud and what I actually show you from Sepharia. But I'll probably do also a stream on like the overlap between the Talmud and the Quran, because that's a huge topic.
Continuity transmission. If Jay objects to any of these, let me know which one. One clarification before we begin, and it matters for how you score this debate. Jay typically, although there was a little bit of mixture in that opening statement, does not defend the Christianity of modern America or Europe. In his own words, and I quote, in reality, democracies are oligarchies. He rejects the liberal West root and branch. So tonight, he cannot borrow its prestige, although I think he kind of did that. He must defend what his tradition actually built when it held power. And he has told us what that is. He did in the opening statement. He says, and I quote, that the Symphonia was the norm throughout the Byzantine period. He's fixated on Byzantium as an Eastern Orthodox Christian, which I understand. Byzantium and Tsarist Russia. That is his exhibit. So hold him to that. Here is my case in one sentence. Islam offers society a revealed order, a living history, and measurable results, and Orthodoxy, on all three counts, offers none. First, revelation versus improvisation. Jay says the question is a revealed doctrine of governance. Very well. Open the New Testament and look for one. There is no criminal code, no commercial law, no constitution, no system of taxation for the poor. Jesus, peace be upon him, said plainly, my kingdom is not of this world. And in Luke chapter 12, a man brings him the most ordinary social dispute imaginable, an inheritance. And Jesus answers, and I quote, man, who made me a judge or an arbiter over you? He declines
What
to
is
legislate.
this? Is bro really going this route? Is bro really trying to say that Jesus was a hippie lib? Is that what we're doing here, bro? Are you serious, Jake? This is so low tier. Are you freaking kidding me, dude? We have refuted this so many times. Jesus, in the most common prayer we pray, the one that Jesus told us, we are asking for his kingdom to be built on earth just as it is in heaven, in the Our Father. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Hello? My kingdom is not of this world is talking about the source. The source of his kingdom is not of this world. That does not mean we aren't building his kingdom on this world. This is pathetic, Jake. This is so low tier.
Let's also never forget that Protestantism
Thank you for the super chats, guys. As always, I'll go over all super chats at the end.
came out of Christianity, which Jay critiques, and I appreciated much of what he said in his recent interview with Tucker, and was the eventual springboard to modern secular liberalism, which we both critique, which now pervades throughout Western society, both in government and the minds of the people. All of this happened because the Bible and Christianity failed to set...
Did Candace and Andrew officially agree to terms? I knew that was pending. I didn't know that it got solidified. Someone said that Candace and Andrew are going to be debating this Friday, and the topic is Charlie Kirk's whether or not the normie narrative is true, basically, on Charlie Kirk's murder.
Down clear regulations for society. Compare that with the Quran, which in chapter 4 legislates inheritance and whose longest verse is entirely devoted to contracts and debt. One revelation refuses the question of social order, the other answers it in detail. The earliest Christians read their scriptures exactly this way. In the epistle to Diogenes, boasts that Christians dwell in their homelands as sojourners. Tertullian declared that there was nothing more foreign to Christians than public affairs. Origen explained that Christians declined...
By the way, that first one he listed, we don't even know who the author is. This is commonly cited by like leftist Protestants. We don't even know who the author of that text is, and what he's talking about, whoever the author is merely that because this was a time of brutal Christian persecution, right? It's hard to have national identity when your state is literally persecuting you. Now, of course, St. Paul still did. St. Paul still did, and we know this from St. Cleopa Ely, right? And his exegesis of basically nationalism throughout the New Testament, right? Yeah, Jake, you do not have the authority to interpret, and neither do either of these. Right, Tertullian, really? We're going with a heretic? So we're going with an anonymous author and a heretic during the time of Christian persecution, right? How are you going to have national identity during Christian persecution? Are you insane? And even still, St. Paul was able to preserve his national identity, and he was able to employ it and appeal to it. This is actually so low tier.
Public office altogether. And on this, remarkably, Jay agrees with me. These are his words, and I quote,
So an anonymous author that no one considers authoritative and a heretic. Those are the two people that he
in the
cited.
first few centuries of Christianity, they weren't intent on converting the emperor or bringing in a Christian empire. Close quote. Exactly so. For 300 years, the church was apolitical, by its own proud self-description and by Jay's own admission. So where did Orthodox civilization come from? Jay kind of already admitted it.
Yeah,
Not from the gospel.
until we were granted the divine ability to actually organize. Yeah, for the church was built through the blood of the martyrs. It was spread through the blood of the martyrs, which is, by the way, an inverse of how Islam was spread, right? Immediately in the first several hundred years was spread by the sword, whereas Christianity was spread by the blood of the martyrs. And then God granted us the protection through St. Constantine, and then eventually St. Theodosius. Everyone wrongly says it's St. Constantine. St. Constantine legalized Christianity. St. Theodosius made Christianity the state religion, right, in the Byzantine Empire, right? Now, they're both saints, but St. Theodosius accomplished much more than St. Constantine did. But this was granted to us by God, right, when we were given the ability to actually organize. As soon as persecution ceased, we took control of the state. So his evidence that Christianity does not advocate for the taking control of the state, his evidence of this is, why did it take until Constantine? What are we doing here, Jake? This is literally the lowest tier shit. You're better than this. Like, Jake, you are better than this. This is nonsense. I'm sure Jay will end up shredding him on this.
From the empire. Christianity became a state religion by the decree of a Roman.
I did a whole stream on nationalism in Orthodoxy, citing all of our saints talking about this topic. This is so this is revisionist history. This is Reddit tier history.
Emperor Theodosius in 380. Its civil law was Justinian's code, Roman law, which Jay did say. But it was Roman law lightly sprinkled with holy water. Symphonia is Roman imperial architecture with icons on the walls. I call it what it is, baptized Rome. Byzantium is not Christianity's design.
Based? I call it what it is, baptized Rome. Based? Hello? Like, what? What is the problem, Jake? I don't understand. What's the issue? You forgot to attach the Giga Chad meme, bro. You forgot to attach the Giga Chad meme. What are you talking about? Of course it's baptized Rome. The Byzantine Empire, it's just the baptized version of the greatest civilization in human history. That's all it is. Bro, what? Are you serious right now, Jake? This is a terrible opening statement. This is dog shit.
For society, it is Christianity's lack of a design filled in by Caesar. Islam is the mirror opposite. Our prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, did not merely preach a society, he governed one. In Medina, under a written constitution with revealed law covering family, contracts, crime, and a mandatory tax for the poor. We did not borrow a social order from a dying empire. We received one from heaven. By Jay's own criterion, a revealed doctrine of governance, there is exactly one candidate on the stage.
Someone said Muslim Eric Ibarra. Bro, why are all the white Muslim converts fat? Why are they all fat, bro? That's why he's wearing these jammies. He's trying to cover up how fat he is. Jay is shredded because he's on the carnivore diet, bro. All bro eats is meat.
Second, the historical record. Suppose we grant him his baptized Rome.
By the way, guys, we got that dormition starting tomorrow for Old Calendar. All my Old Calendar brothers and sisters. My wife and I are going out for dinner tonight before the fast starts. I think it starts tomorrow. Maybe it technically starts Saturday, but tomorrow's a fast day. But yeah, anyways, so got to lock in, folks. And then you all that are on the new calendar, you already been in that for a week now.
System by what it did to its own saints. In the 7th century, emperors imposed the monothelite heresy.
Yeah, during Ramadan, these bros literally just be feasting in the morning and the night, and they just don't eat They just don't eat like the in-between hours. That's basically what I do normally. I basically don't eat until late in the day anyway. Like these guys will call that fasting. They're literally feasting in the morning and evening.
Christ only had one will in the incarnate state as a state policy. The man who resisted, Maximus the Confessor, whom Jay venerates as his church's great theologian, had his tongue cut out and his right hand cut off by the Orthodox Emperor's state and died in exile. In the 8th century, Emperor Leo banned the icons, and a council under his son ratified it. It was a doctrine dictated from the throne for over a century. And in 1721, fast forwarding, Peter the Great did not merely pressure the church, he abolished the Patriarchate of Moscow and ran the church as a government.
What is this statement, bro? What is his point? Oh, there was times when this type of Christians were persecuted, like, by the state, but it was still claiming to be Christian. Okay? Are you pretending like there weren't the same thing doesn't happen in Islam? How about the whole controversy between Sunni and Shia Islam? That's like what that entire thing is about. Way worse. It's actually way worse. So I don't understand what his point is here, bro.
Department under a lay bureaucrat for nearly 200 years.
This is a horrible opening
statement. This is not one bad king. This is a system with no breaks. And his own church's law tells us why. Every state on earth rests at bottom on the lawful sword. Armies, courts, and punishment. But listen to Orthodoxy's own canon law about that sword. St. Basil's 13th canon, ratified as binding law by his church's own councils, says that the killing in war that is not reckoned as murder is even pardonable in defense of piety, and yet leaves the hands not clean and counsels the soldier to abstain from communion for 3 years. Lawful and yet still defiling. And when Emperor Nicephorus Phocas...
Yes, because we have sanctity for human life, dude. Because we have sanctity for human life. And by the way, those canons there's economia, right? Right? There's economia for these canons. So they're enforced by the bishop. They can be granted exceptions, right? In fact, the 3 years is the maximum, right? So it's kind of like Old Testament law. It's kind of like when you see like a sign that's like, you know, no littering, fines up to $500, right? It's like that's the maximum, right? So yeah, there's a sanctity for human life in Orthodoxy. That does not mean that it's not virtuous to defend your homeland and to defend yourself and your family and those you are responsible for. We went over all of this in my episode. I refute this in detail. You guys go watch my episode on nationalism, because I refute this all in detail.
The church itself venerates, asked the patriarch to crown his fallen soldiers as martyrs when they were facing Muslims.
The different Sunni confessions, right, were at war with one another. Great point.
The patriarch refused him, citing that very canon. It is recorded in his church's own canonical commentaries. A church whose priests may not bear arms, whose soldiers need 3 years as cleansing after lawful war, is a church whose...
Guys, please like and subscribe. Please like the live and subscribe to my channel. I'm an Orthodox Christian. I'm a far-right individual. I'm against replacement. I'm against Zionism. I'm against Islam. I love Christ, particularly I love the Orthodox Church. That's me. So please subscribe if you're into that.
Own law declares the state's business is not our business. Symphonia did not fail by accident. It was a marriage the bride's own law forbade, which is why again and again the groom simply took command. And then later the ledger...
Saying that Symphonia failed just because we don't currently have... I mean, we kind of do. Like Russia is kind of an Orthodox, you know, it's kind of an Orthodox empire. It's better than anything. I mean, listen, the Ottoman Empire fell too. Like, I don't understand what his point is here.
TM fell 1453.
By the way, like, this bro is like just talking about history. Like, let's talk about what we got going on in the world right now. Let's talk about why you're speaking English. Huh? Let's talk about that, Jake. How come you're speaking English and not Arabic? Let's talk about why you are using technology developed by Europeans, not Muslims, right? To give this opening statement on this laptop that was invented by Europeans, this microphone that was developed and invented by Europeans, in a society developed and invented by Christian Europeans, and that you are living here in America, which is a Christian European nation, and not in Afghanistan. Let's talk about that, huh? You don't want to talk about that, because as soon as the debate goes there, you're cooked.
Tsarist Russia destroyed 1917. Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, all of the crowns gone. Greece, an Orthodox nation voting freely, abolished its monarchy in 1974, 69% to 31. Tonight, the number of Orthodox monarchies on earth is exactly 0. And I do not need to argue the conclusion, because Jay has argued it for me. His word...
Putin's kind of a monarch, you know what I mean?
Although he was a little bit softer, but this is what he said in the video on the top.
I'm just saying. He's kind of like a quasi, Orthodox monarch.
Restoring this system is, quote, not viable and way down the road. His words, quote, it's LARPing to act like we're going to resurrect the Byzantine Empire. It's come and gone, dude. Yeah, it has. It's come and gone, dude. LARPing, Jay's word, not mine. Meanwhile, Islamic law has been continuously practiced for 14 centuries and orders the daily lives of 2 billion people today. His model is a museum piece.
And Christian law is literally where we get common law. The Christian moral fabric is where we get common law, which is literally the fabric of all developed societies in the entire world. Oh, there's all these nations that are enforcing Sharia law where women are second-class citizens and child marriage is legal and you can marry your cousin and you get the death penalty if you say that Islam is false and convert to Christianity. Yeah, guys, but all the common law that is literally the fabric. The common law that is literally a fabric for all of the civilizations, everything Jake benefits from, that comes from Christianity.
Prayer 5 times a day. Third, measurable results. Because better for society is an empirical claim, let us measure. Take one social poison, alcohol, 2.6 million deaths every year by the World Health Organization's
Someone said Putin
count.
is not a
with
monarch.
a massive
Bro, Putin, he literally revises the policy like every couple years so that he can stay in office. Like, what else would you call that? Like, he's just in perpetual power. Like, he is a quasi-monarch.
Share of the world's homicides, traffic deaths, and battered families. Islam solved this by revelation 14 centuries ago, and Muslim societies sit at the bottom of the world's consumption tables, while the heartland of Orthodox monarchy became the world's case study in alcohol catastrophe. And Islam does not merely prohibit, it provides. Zakat, a mandatory transfer of wealth to the poor. Not charity we recommend, but law we obey. And the deepest measure...
Okay, we have almsgiving. What's the point? Christians give the most in charity, by far. So who's actually... See, this is what Muslims will do. They'll ignore the actual... How these things actually manifest, right? So Christians are actually the ones that are giving more charity, right? This is the same with the child marriage thing. They'll try to take Deuteronomy out of context, when in reality... right? That's Deuteronomy is actually teaching the opposite, like Jay explained at the beginning. But also, no Christian nations are participating in that en masse, like they are in Muslim nations, as high as 76% in certain Muslim nations.
Does the society continue? And does the faith transmit? Orthodoxy's heartlands are demographically collapsing. And after 1,000 years of symphonia, 6% of Orthodox Russians attend church weekly. Meanwhile, Muslims maintain the highest religious retention on earth. Islam is the fastest growing faith in the world. And on this, once more, I call Jay as my witness. His words in his own
fastest
lecture.
growing religion, because of birth rates. Because you guys are having a freaking shitload of babies. That's the reason.
Islam is, quote...
And you also have the highest apostasy rate.
Destroying the West, theologically...
despite apostasy laws.
Philosophically speaking, demographically speaking, close quote. He meant it as an indictment of the West's weakness, but hear what he conceded on the very measures this debate is about. He grants that Islam prevails. One tradition kept its children, the other kept its icons. So let me close where I began. Jay said the question is whether there is a revealed doctrine of the magistrate. I agree. I have shown you the revealed order his scriptures lack and mine contain. A history in which his system devoured its saints, was disqualified by its own canons, and then went extinct, not coming back by Jay's words, while mine never stopped, and measurable results in sobriety, charity, families, and faith transmitted. Results he has conceded in his own voice. He must now show you a Christian social order that came from Christ rather than Caesar, a mechanism that stops the next Peter the Great, a single living example of what he proposes, and results measured in lives, not incense. A kingdom not of this world cannot govern this world. Islam was sent to do exactly that. That is why on the question before us tonight, the answer is Islam. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that opening.
Yeah, that was awful.
We have
That was
a little rebuttal, because if we immediately go into the 60 minutes, we won't be able. There's a lot that came up. So could we have like a 5-minute back and forth, and then you do the open part, or no?
I have to defer to Jake, just because you guys already agreed on the format. So Jake, whether you want to grant that, or a hybrid of something like that, or...
How about 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Time?
5 and 5.
Deal.
And,
All
then,
right.
and then open. Is that cool? Appreciate
You got it. I've got the timer set for you for that 5-minute rebuttal. Jay, the floor is all yours.
Yeah, only because a lot of things were brought up, which is fine. I know in an opening statement a lot's going to be brought up, and so of course you can respond to. I want to note that. So first of all, yeah, I've said democracies are fake and gay many times over. So, I mean, a lot of repeating all the stuff that I said, and I think everybody here would agree democracy is fake and gay. So now we have a constitutional republic, and it is possible for a constitutional republic to be Christian or to be Christianized. I don't deny that. It's just that that doesn't exist in the history of the church. The normative principle history of the church is, in the Orthodox Church, for example, a coronation service where you have a king coronated by the church, and so the authority for the temporal realm comes from the spiritual. The church is not apolitical. It's
again
separate.
surprising to hear him grant that you can have a constitutional republic that is basically Christianized. I've made this point all the time, guys. It's way more, as much as I love monarchy, like, who is in charge matters way more than the system. You can have a Orthodox constitutional republic. Is that ideal? No. Is it possible? Yes. It's the same with capitalism. Can you have Christianized capitalism? Yeah. Is the medieval guild system better? Also, yes. Okay? These things can all be true at the same time.
This division of spheres. And this is unfortunately one of the mistakes of the
Pragmatically, a Christianized constitutional republic with Christianized capitalism is what we're going to have in America.
Enlightenment and the Protestant Reformation, but not even the first generation of the Protestant reformers. They were, in fact, many of them monarchists. In fact, Luther's Reformation wouldn't have been successful in Germany had he not had the support of the German princes. So the early reformers were, except for Calvin, monarchists or Republican, but they were still theocrats. And so my position, by the way, is not that the church is apolitical. The church has
I think Jim Bob just raided me. What's up, Jim Bob's viewers?
To say about politics. I wrote an article, an essay many years ago. You can find it on my website. I won't read it all. About the principle of the death penalty, for example. That's a principle that is carried over from the Old Testament to the New Testament. It's cited many times in the New Testament that you have that the king has a duty to punish evildoers. Romans 13. Peter says that the king has a duty to enforce the moral law and its punishments. That does include the death penalty. Because there was a debate in the first, second, and third century about whether a Christian could be a member of the army or the state, does not mean that the church taught some other thing. There's a period, a time of controversy and debate.
Jim
and at
Bob
the Council of Nicaea,
viewers. Thanks, Jim Bob. Jim Bob's the GOAT. Thank you, guys. Please, all my new viewers, guys. I'm Ben Michael. I'm an Orthodox Christian. I'm far right. I love Jim Bob. Welcome. We're reacting to Jay's stream or Jay's debate with Jake, the Muslim quote unquote metaphysician. Guys, give me a like and subscribe on the live. Thanks, Jim Bob.
Actually decide and determine that, yes, you can be a soldier and be a Christian. So the canons in Nicaea include this principle, and they looked to...
Guys, over here, if you're into it, I talk about politics mostly. I talk about anti-Zionism. I talk about Islam. I talk about replacement in particularly Christian Western nations, immigration. I'm an Orthodox Christian. These are the things I talk about. So if you're into that, please subscribe and like the live. Let's push it out to the algorithm. Jim Bob's the GOAT. I'll have to send him a thank you later.
Actually, when John the Baptist is asked, what must we do? When the Roman soldiers ask him, he says, do not abuse the people and do not charge too much in taxes. Thus, it is possible to be a soldier. The entire Byzantine model of the Basileus, as he's called, is that he is likened to King David. King David is the classic iconographic image of the king or the emperor in the Byzantine model. The New Testament...
Guys, to catch you up, so far, old Jake here, his opening statement was literally just, Jesus was actually a hippie lib. That's why you can't have an Orthodox political state, because Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. That was basically the argument so far, which is nonsense, because Jesus literally, in the most common prayer to Christians, he commands us to pray, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. So we are building his kingdom on earth just as it is in heaven. His kingdom not being of this earth, all that means is simply that his kingdom is not sourced from this earth, obviously. That does not mean we do not build his kingdom here on earth.
Many passages.
So Jake's opening statement was pathetic. And then he also brought up different disagreements in like the monophysites, when there was monophysite emperors, as if he doesn't have the same problem with Muslim caliphates persecuting the Shia, for example, or even other Sunnis.
Cite not just the Old Testament laws in a typological sense, but many of the moral principles of the Old Testament laws are carried over. Paul, in his letters, for example, cites not sewing together two cloths in the same
Welcome all from the Jim Bob Rabe. Welcome all. Thanks again.
Not sewing together the same seeds in a field. Those are ceremonial commands, but they carry a moral significance. And early Christian society, because it was not dominant, because it was in the catacombs, still had the principle, as you see with St. Clement, for example, who taught the death penalty. St. Athanasius, for example, who taught the death penalty, who also said it's virtuous to kill in war in the right scenario, in the right situation. It can be a virtue. Now, in the case of why there's a canon to forbid a person from communing in certain instances, that's because, like in the Old Testament, David was told, even though he was a virtuous hero in war and God taught him to use his bow and to fight, because he had killed so many, he was told, I don't want you to build the temple. That will be Solomon, because your son is a son of peace. And the church maintains that principle that although you can still be saved, it is appropriate because of the nature of violence and warfare, that there's a time of repentance, even in a virtuous time of warfare, because warfare is nasty.
Yes.
Jake's own position
which is obvious, by the way. Like, obviously, as humans, like, if you have an actual desire to kill somebody, like, you actually crave that, that is a sign of your noose is darkened. Like, that is not a good sign, okay? You should be doing it out of absolute necessity. It is virtuous in certain circumstances. And by the way, to all my new viewers, I did a full stream on Orthodox nationalism and defending your land. You guys should go check that out. It was just a couple weeks ago. Go check it out. I did a full stream explaining how the Orthodox Church's teachings throughout all of history has been that you ought to defend your land, and that includes giving your life for your land and for your people. All of that is true. But we still have a sanctity for human life in the Orthodox Church, and we recognize that that is not ideal, that taking human life is not ideal. It is necessary in certain circumstances, and it is even virtuous in those circumstances, but it is not ideal.
Actually riddled with a bunch of inconsistencies because he pointed to some bad leaders. Of course, there's going to be bad tyrants and kings. That has nothing to do with whether Christianity is successful in building a civilization. In fact, I gave the example of the Christian Byzantine Empire as the longest lasting and most successful. Yes, it fell apart, but Jake, there's been many bad sultans according to your own position. Does that mean that because I found a bad sultan here and there, from your view, that, I guess the whole thing has failed? It's just a really bad argument. Again, the fact that an emperor could apostatize or that an emperor could try to enforce heresy is irrelevant to the question of whether Christianity or Islam is better for society. Because, of course, we all would admit that you could have a corrupt ruler. That has nothing to do with which system is actually beneficial to society. You said that the social order is not in the New Testament, it's borrowed. Again, there's countless passages in the New Testament that are also principled in the Old Testament. So the New Testament doesn't abrogate.
To all the Jim Bob viewers, guys, I focus a little bit more on different topics than Jim Bob. I talk about anti-Zionism. I'm an anti-Zionist. I talk about Islam. I believe in banning Islam in society. I talk about current political events a lot, particularly replacement immigration. I talk about these issues a lot. So if you're into more modern, like sort of current events, politics, that's what I talk about. I'm an American nationalist. I'm an Orthodox Christian. So if you're into that, you can subscribe and check out my channel. I would encourage you to, as a good starting point, introduction to my channel, check out my stream on Orthodox nationalism I just did. I think it was like a week and a half ago.
These principles, it continues these principles.
And I'm live every Tuesday and Thursday at 2 o'clock Eastern. So you can always tune in.
For example, we have the laws of the kings in the Old Testament and the limitations in the Torah on kings. So those principles carried over into Christian civilization in Christian law. So the fact that there's a separation between church and state is not a division between church and state. So most of your argument hinged on a sort of Protestant understanding of what symphonia actually is. Is that it?
That was about it. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much for that rebuttal. Appreciate it, Jay. Got the timer set for you as well, Jake. 5 minutes.
I just want to say at the outset, I was not planning to machine gun tactic Jay at all. That wasn't the point, and it wasn't originally part the rebuttal, which I also thought was a bit strange. I thought there should be a rebuttal, so that's fine with me. But Jay has mentioned a lot of things, but one thing he mentioned about Protestantism.
Yeah, guys, I'm big on talking about both issues. I talk about Judaism, I talk about Zionism, I talk about Islam, I talk about mass immigration. I talk about Islam and Israel/Judaism pretty much equally. I consider them both to be equal threats. You guys I did a whole stream on the teachings of the Talmud, and I sourced the actual quotes from Sepharia. So you can go check out that stream too if that's something you're into. I do all kinds of streams like this against the Muslim infiltration. I did one. I reacted to Sneeko and Alex Jones. We should deport Sneeko. I'm a single issue voter. We're going to deport Sneeko. We're also going to deport Hassan Piker. I just did a stream about that the other day.
True, what I'm saying. But I want to actually give a quote from my previous debate opponent earlier today, Michael Jones, Inspiring Philosophy. He says this: Christianity is not a political system or a culture. When you try to weaponize Christianity to be something it was never intended to be, you will always...
I wonder when IP said this, by the way, because IP lately has been much more like heading towards the Christian nationalist like rhetoric, which, by the way, guys, I like to use the term Christianized nationalism, because Christianized nationalism doesn't have the same like Protestant sort of like baggage. So if you say Christian nationalism, everybody thinks Protestantism, right? Christianized nationalism, I think, is a better descriptor, but I've seen IP sort of heading closer to that direction lately.
So you're right, Jay. I am actually running an argument that is, I think, an outgrowth of Protestantism, but I think that the question that we need to ask ourselves is, why is that the case? How, and I'm actually genuinely interested to have this discussion in the open discussion section. Hopefully we'll all learn a lot, but I'm genuinely questioning how is it the case that
Jim Bob
secular liberalism became so abundant and so popular in the West. It seems to be a natural outgrowth of Protestantism and its movement, which I see actually in with respect to the political sphere to be an outgrowth of the Bible. Now, that's obviously the debate. That's where Jay would disagree, but I'd like to really understand that from his perspective. So this isn't necessary. I mean, Michael might even be willing to come on the stage and debate Jay, because I don't think he agrees with monarchies and theocracies and that sort of thing, and that's totally fine. But I'm just saying that this position is not merely mine, and I'm openly admitting that this is, at least this aspect of it, is a critique from a form of Protestantism. Jay said a lot in his opening statement. Most of what he had to say, if you notice, regarding laws and legislation and all of that, came from two places. One, the Old Testament, and then two, which he mentioned earlier, was from St. Justinian. Now, I'm agreeing that that's where Jay's framework is for the debate, but I think we have to question, why is it not embedded in the New Testament? Maybe Jay would argue that it is. And I'm happy to look at
building the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven, right? St. Paul appealing to his citizenship as a Roman. The talk of nations throughout the New Testament, talking about the existence of nations, how all nations, tribes, and tongues will come together, right? Well, in order for all nations, tribes, and tongues to come together at the end to worship Christ, those nations have to exist. That is nationalism. That is the interpretation of our Orthodox saints. That is nationalism. The fact that on Pentecost, each individual language was sanctified and baptized, right? That was a signifier of each nation, which, by the way, is an ethnos. That's what a nation is. Each nation was being baptized. That's what that signifies. That literally is nationalism. So it actually is embedded in the New Testament. You're just using Reddit tier nonsense arguments to say that Jesus was actually a liberal.
some of those passages. Yes, you made a point about the evil rulers and those who were tyrants and not necessarily following the law.
Jesus,
yes,
who
I agree that this happened in Islamic history.
Calls the Pharisees sons of Satan, right? He was a liberal, guys. Trust me. He calls the Jews sons of Satan, but he's totally a lefty.
This happens even today in certain Islamic nations or Muslim nations. I wasn't making the argument purely based on that. I was saying that as opposed to Islam, and I'm happy to argue that, there seems to be a much greater pattern of that in Jay's understanding, or not Jay's understanding, but the history in Christianity. That's what I was trying to argue. Not that one ruler makes it null and void. That's an evil
what is
ruler,
Unc doing
but
over
it
here?
seems to be much more pervasive. Let's see what else. I made some notes. He mentioned about usury. I think that's a point we can agree on. And there's another party that I don't know. Sometimes we can't say their names, but I think
dog whistle. Like I pointed out at the beginning of the stream, guys, if you say usury instead of interest, it's already it's a JQ dog whistle. That's another thing, guys. I'm JQ'd, so if you are into that or if you don't like that, you're not gonna like my channel. But that is something I talk about quite a
they're
bit.
largely responsible for that.
Nigerians?
What's that?
Nigerians?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's something that we can actually agree on. In fact, I think there's a lot that Jay and I can agree on. I think that both he and I deplore secular liberalism.
Also, guys, please like the live and subscribe.
Is pervasive in the West. I think we both do think it's what he said, gay and weird. But at the same time, I'm arguing that the reason why this came about in Western society is because I do think that there is a lack of clarity on the doctrine of the governance of the church and how it relates to society, especially in the New Testament. And because of that,
no more lack of clarity than there is in Muslim societies, bro. That's why you have all these disagreements. That's why you have caliphates, suppressing different Sunni confessions, obviously the Shias and vice versa. So to say that this is because of some lack of clarity in the New Testament is utter nonsense.
That's
because
why
we had full unity on this question as soon as we had a chance to breathe in Christian history in the 4th century under St. Constantine and St. Theodosius. As soon as St. Constantine and St. Theodosius came into power and we were able to actually breathe and not be martyred en masse, right? Then we organized and we united under a common, the Symphonia, right? The Byzantine two-headed eagle. We united under a common dynamic, which all Christian societies, just about all Christian societies, have tried to emulate to some extent, all the way up until Tsarist Russia, and the Western monarchs as well also modeled themselves after this.
I think you get this outgrowth of Protestantism, and even what we have in the U.S., a separation of church and state.
Yeah, and separation of church and state has nothing to. There's actually Symphonia and separation of church and state are compatible, because separation of church and state, all it meant was that the church and the state are not the same entity. That's all it means, which, by the way, only the Roman Catholics and only the late medieval Roman Catholics would actually disagree with this, because why? They implemented the papal states. So they implement the papal states, and now the church and the state become the same entity. Up until that point, the emperor and the patriarchs were they were separate entities. Now, was there overlap on the underlying fabric? Yes. because the emperor was held accountable by the patriarchs, like with St. Ambrose excommunicating St. Theodosius when he slaughtered civilians en masse, right? And then he repented. So there was accountability, but there's still separate entities. That's all that separation of church and state means. And Jefferson's letter about church and state being separate, you guys know what it was? It was him promising a Baptist church that the state is not going to get involved with their affairs. That was what it was. And it was just a letter. It's not even a binding document. And 12 out of 14 of the original state constitutions in America had explicitly Christian language and had state-mandated churches. It's including Vermont, by the way, if you include Vermont as one of the original states. So yeah, all this to say, separation of church and state is actually compatible with Symphonia.
The point where people like Michael Jones would criticize much of what Jay, I think, has to say about the monarchy and theocracy. Let me just see a couple more points here. Yeah, so, back to that point that I want people to notice a lot of what Jay is saying is coming from the Old Testament, not the New Testament. The question is why? Why didn't Christ reestablish that? It seems to be that everything that he was trying to say was not a political order. And yes, I agree that just because some people disagreed in the early church, that doesn't mean necessarily that's the correct position. But it seems that was there very early on, and we don't see that in Islam.
No, he cited an anonymous author and Tertullian who is a heretic. And it was during the time when Christians were being brutally persecuted. How are you going to have national identity during that time? Oh, Christians are sojourners. Yeah, that's because their nation is literally trying to kill them. So maybe that's why they wrote that they're sojourners. They're having a hard time identifying with their nation because they're trying to be killed by their nation. And Paul was still able to have that identity even when he was trying to be killed by his nation.
Thank you very much for that rebuttal as well from Jake. We will jump into the open dialogue, gentlemen. We will let this be as organic as you'd like it to be. If it gets crazy, I'll jump in. The floor is all yours.
Yeah, I have a question, if you don't mind, Jay. Sure. So, maybe you can help me out with this. I think you agree with me that Western,
I knew he was going to do this. He's going to try to pit. I'm curious where Jay goes with this. He's going to try to pit Western Christianity against Eastern Christianity.
Liberalism that we experience in the West and the U.S. and most European countries is an event, and the Protestants in the audience might not like this, but is an eventual outgrowth of Protestantism. Now, I'm making it one step back further that I think that it's because Christianity didn't have clear dictates on the doctrine of, how the church should relate to the state. Now, obviously, you don't agree with that. So how do you explain how this came to be out of Protestantism?
One thing I would say is the concerns of the first, second, third century church was not mainly politics, but it doesn't follow from a focus that's different, that therefore there is no doctrine of the state, there is no idea of a basileus or theocracy. I would actually argue for theocracy. So you have, for example, setting aside...
And a type of theocracy, right, that he's advocating for is not where they become the same entity. That's what a lot of people think a theocracy is. And that's where, if someone asks me if I believe in theocracy, I would say it depends on what you mean. Because I believe in the Byzantine model, the Tsarist Russia model, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the same entity, which is like what it was at the Papal States.
Principles in Mosaic law. You have, for example, many Old Testament prophecies in Daniel 2, from our perspective, that the kingdom under which the empire or the Messiah would be born would eventually permeate and become the kingdom of the Messiah. For us, that's a prophecy of Christ's birth under the Roman Empire and the Christianization over time of the Roman Empire. So there's also, in many passages of Isaiah, we believe prophecies about the Christian kings that would come to be in the future. So these are principles that are there that you can even see the earliest church fathers citing these messianic prophecies as giving the idea, at least, that, there's going to be the notion of Christian states in the future, but it was not their primary concern in the first, second, third century when they're in the catacombs, for example.
Remember what we read, guys, from the Russian Synod of 2000 about how Israel itself was actually a prescription for it, obviously Old Testament Israel, not modern nation state invented in 1948. The Old Testament Israel was a prescription for what a nation was supposed to be, right? And now that's extended to all nations. All nations are now chosen, right? All nations are now chosen. They've been brought into the fold, or at least they can if they get baptized and Christianized, right? So from our perspective, from an Orthodox perspective, that's what Israel was in the Old Testament, was a prescription for what a nation is supposed to be.
To figure out the mechanics of the relationship of state and church. So it's only natural that when the imperium does become Christianized, that's when we would start to see from the Edict of Toleration with Constantine, and then Theodosius is really the first emperor to put some Christian laws into practice, and then St. Justinian with his code being explicitly Christian. So the fact that it sort of evolves, it doesn't follow from that the application...
Thanks, guys, for the super chats. As always, I go over all super chats at the end.
...evolves that the principle...
I'm also going to do a members-only live stream at the end of today. Guys, I do, for my new viewers, I do a members-only live stream at the end of every... Try to do it at the end of every stream. where I go over different Orthodox saints quotes on nationalism, race, and some World War II things too. So if you're interested in that, you can sign up for my memberships to support me monthly.
Were not in the New Testament or that they evolved, because I could give you tons of examples of legal principles of continuity from Old to New Testament, which are in the New Testament and in the Church Fathers that are principles applied. Again, the death penalty is one classic example. It's assumed that the early church tended to not affirm the death penalty. There are a couple church fathers that do not, but actually the majority, if you look at the essay that I wrote on this on my website, I cite examples from Clement to Athanasius to Ambrose, all affirming the death penalty. That's just one example.
I appreciate that. My question is not more so about what happened in the early period, but from what you're saying is that wasn't their focus in the first 3 centuries. Understand that. Then you have, as you said, and we both agree with this historical narrative, Justinian becomes explicitly Christian and then kind of develops further. But
I just sent over the in the chat, guys. I just sent the link to the article that Jay is talking about. Very good article. Very good article on the death penalty.
I guess my question is, from that point, from Justinian going forward to wherever you demarcate where, I don't know, either Byzantium fell or maybe even after that, because there's really no true Christian monarchies today. I mean, unless you can tell me one. From that period, what changed? Why did it change from the church having this vision, which you deemed to be correct, to all of a sudden, having what we experience today in the West? I mean, because it's not governed by Christian law.
So basically, even the Roman Catholic West, after the schism, for many centuries, still maintained the same principle of the need for a Christian state, for Christian laws. So even
and do you guys also see how everyone is starting to return back to this now? Everyone is starting to realize, and guys, again, there's this huge misconception about the founding of America, right? That it was like this secular state. For those of you who are not familiar, I want to show my new followers from Jibbob's stream this quote from Joseph Story. All my followers know this well. My followers know this well. And it's a quote from Joseph Story, who was one of the early Supreme Court justices, who wrote a commentary. It's the second most authoritative commentary on the Constitution, and particularly on the First Amendment. And I want to read this quote to you guys to show you how much you've been lied to about the founding of the United States of America, and particularly the First Amendment, and what the First Amendment was actually for. So this is his commentary, again, literally second most authoritative commentary on the Bill of Rights, right behind the Federalist Papers, which, by the way, guys, I have similar quotes in the Federalist Papers from John Jay, but this one is even stronger. The real object of the amendment was, talking about the First Amendment, the real object of the amendment was not to countenance, much less advance, Islam, Judaism, or infidelity by prostrating Christianity, but to exclude all rivalry among Christian sects and to prevent any national ecclesiastical establishment. Guys, there was even a 1799 Supreme Court decision in Maryland that said the exact same thing, that said the First Amendment was about eliminating controversy among Christian sects, not to allow for Judaism or secularism or Islam. That was not the purpose of the First Amendment. So there's this huge misconception about the founding of America, and really it wasn't until the 1960s that we became secularized, when we went through the sexual revolution, we went through the civil rights movement, we implemented mass migration or we at least laid the groundwork for mass migration via the Hart-Celler Act. And so during that time, you also had these, under the guise of anti-fascism, figures like Theodor Adorno, who was Jewish, basically these thinkers that were basically saying that the family was a fascist idea. In fact, they created what's called the F scale. And on the F scale, if you were a white person and you believed in having white children, that was a sign of fascism. Guys, there were blasphemy laws implemented by the Founding Fathers. There are 6 states where there are still blasphemy laws. There are 6 states where now they're not enforced, but there are literally still blasphemy laws in America. So there's this huge misconception about how America was founded, that it was founded as just like this secular state or something. It's total bullshit. The vast majority of the Founding Fathers were confessional Protestant Christians. Vast majority. Between the 55, 56 that signed the Declaration of Independence and Constitution, over 50 of them. were confessional Protestant Christians. Some of them were Orthodox or Catholic, like Philip Ludwell III was an Orthodox Christian who is a founding father of the United States of America. John Paradise was the tutor of Thomas Jefferson, who was a Greek Orthodox Christian. There was 1,400 Greek Orthodox in St. Augustine, Florida in 1768. 1,400 Greek Orthodox came to St. Augustine, Florida, the first ever city in the United States, in America. In Alaska, when it was absorbed into the United States, 1/3 of its population was Orthodox. So there's this huge misconception. And by the way, guys, the vast majority of the Founding Fathers were also not Masons. They weren't even Masons. Over 40 of those 55, 56 that signed the Declaration of Independence and Constitution were not Masons. They were confessional Protestant Christians who were not Masons. So many of you have been lied to about America's founding, including Jake. And I cannot wait to debate this topic with one of these dudes because they have no idea what they're talking about. They paint it as if America is this like secular state. No, it's not. And if you look at all the Supreme Court decisions up until really the 20th century, that was how it was interpreted. It was interpreted as a Christian nation.
Of East and West, there's literally no
Go
difference.
read the original state constitutions. Go read where it says you had to confess the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit to be in office. It says you have to confess the divine revelation of the Old and New Testaments to hold office. Guys, these are in the original state constitutions. Do you know why they didn't allow for a state church at the federal level? Is it because they didn't want Christianity to be the state religion? No. It's because they didn't want to contradict the state constitutions that already implemented Christian churches as the state church. That was the reason why they didn't create a state church at the federal level. And because they thought it was an overreach on the states, because they believed it was a state issue. So many people have been lied to about America's founding, dude. It's actually crazy.
Between these two groups on this principle. Now, how that's applied, yeah, of course, the Roman Catholic West has a tendency to put the papacy in a greater geopolitical position that we would disagree with. I noticed that one of your arguments, for example, was hinging on the idea that the church is apolitical. No. What those canons mean is that members of the clergy are not supposed to be in the state. Right. So that's our perspective on that. But to say explicitly where it began to devolve, I would say, is you have a series of events that occur in the West, particularly Protestant Reformation, Scientific Enlightenment, Enlightenment itself, Scientific Revolution, Enlightenment. So all these three events, I think, are a cascading series of revolutions that really don't have much to do with Christianity. I would criticize Protestants in that they might have helped that revolutionary fervor. I don't think they necessarily meant to do that, but I would say that I know that I think Jake's tactic is to set the Protestants and the Catholics and the Orthodox against each other. That's a classic Jake tactic, which I don't blame you for doing it because I did the same thing, right? So I was like, the Naim guy is like a Quran only, and they don't like each other. So I don't blame Jake for doing it. So it's what you do in debates. But again, I think that the Protestant Reformation has a revolutionary.
Yeah, to all the new viewers, guys, you should check out Codrianu. Particularly get his book For My Legionaries. I recommend getting the one with Michael the Archangel on the cover. Check out that book, guys. If you're Orthodox and you're like far right, you have to read For My Legionaries by Codrianu. A lot of my platform and my show is based on Codrianu and his views. Also, my biggest platform is Instagram. So if you're on Instagram, follow me at RealBenMichael. And that's where I post most of my regular content. I'm also live every Tuesday and Thursday at 2 o'clock Eastern.
Goes to it
on
that
YouTube.
It even didn't intend, because of the fact that the earliest reformers were still monarchists. The English Reformation, even with Henry VIII as the so-called head of the church, it still was a monarchical structure of the state.
Yeah, this is another crucial point. When people try to say that, America's a Protestant nation, it's like, well, yeah, but they were fleeing another Protestant nation. They were fleeing an Anglican nation, which is Protestant. So were they really a Protestant nation? Is Protestant even a real category, considering they were anathematizing and killing each other over theology?
Even the Vatican upheld this principle of the Christian state until the time of Vatican II. So, I'm trying to take up the time, but the simple answer is there's a series of revolutions, and those revolutions affect the Islamic world just as much as the West. So, perhaps you could argue that Islam more explicitly maintained the belief that it should be, that God's law should apply to the state. I would agree with you. But I would not say that that's the consistent traditional Christian position. It happens to be the Protestant tendency, even though the first generation Protestants didn't really believe that.
Right. I'm not trying to do that in a bad way. I genuinely believe that narrative. I believe the narrative that this was an outgrowth of Protestantism. I mean, I think when you have sola scriptura, which is essentially a denial of the church's authority to preach and teach what is the correct understanding of Scripture, and then
You know what's ironic about this? The Protestant nations still mog the Muslim nations. They still mog the Muslim nations, dude. And that's why you're living in a Protestant nation. Hello, Jake. You're living in a primarily Protestant nation, shitting on Protestant nations in favor of Muslim nations. Are you retarded? Are you kidding me? Do you not see how self-defeating this is? Even the Protestant nations mog your freaking shithole countries, dude. That's why you're freaking LARPing all our tech right now. You're freaking LARPing all of our technology developed by European Christians, bro. Go live in a shithole Muslim country. See how that works out for you.
Yourself, that authority, this sort of individualism, not rightly, but naturally leads to, I'm not saying there are obviously links in the chain along the way,
Sure.
but I'm saying that I think this Protestant doctrine of sola scriptura in its crudest form, just me and my Bible in my closet, eventually leads to...
Which isn't what the Reformers believed, by the way. That didn't develop until literally, again, like the 1960s. Like in the last, maybe at most 100 years, that's when that actually developed. It all culminates in the 1960s. But like what he's talking about is literally, oh, he moved to Morocco? Oh my gosh. But he's still speaking English. Notice that too. Not speaking Arabic. Nope, he's LARPing our language.
Not only
I didn't know he moved to Morocco. That's actually crazy. That's actually
Rome
wild.
to tell you what is the understanding of Scripture. You don't want any legislative
But
authority.
guess all those Moroccans literally, yeah, he lives in Brown, Spain. All those Moroccans just invaded Spain because of how terrible it is. They're talking about how awful Morocco is, and they had to go to Spain. They had to go to another Christian nation. Give me a break.
Over you to be governing by laws that they see as Christian when you don't agree with that. And so I think it is an eventual natural outgrowth of Protestantism and the doctrine of sola scriptura, which
When did he
leads to this
move?
kind of fundamental societal
he move?
individualism that we experience in the West. I don't think anybody should deny that, especially if you're not Protestant. So I'm not using that as a gotcha. I genuinely believe that was a trajectory. However, I want to give the Protestants a little bit more credit in saying that, well, I don't think that this happened out of nowhere. Where did they get this idea or belief from?
He literally just moved there in 2024. So in other words, he lived in a Protestant nation for most of his life.
The church should not really be involved in the state. I mean, it seems to me, and what you said, I do kind of appreciate that from the Islamic perspective, I think the reason why this happens is because Islam, whether you agree with the laws or not, that's not really the discussion right now, is that it is very clearly political. There is no separation between church and state or church and mosque. It's very, very explicit and clear, and I think that lack of clarity that exists or doesn't exist in Christianity is the reason why you eventually had the Protestant Reformation and then what I think this sort of secular liberalism, which eventually is an outgrowth of Protestantism, is because the church and the Bible were not as clear on its doctrine of church and state. That's what I'm arguing.
If they were not that clear, you would not have the level of unanimity from the 4th century until even literally up until 1800s when the revolutions took over Europe. I mean, you have over 1,000 years of really no dissension amongst significant groups, East and West, in this principle of symphonia. In fact, Holy Roman Empire amongst the Catholics had the exact same symbol of the double-headed eagle that the Eastern Byzantine Empire has of the double-headed eagle. And for those that don't know, the meaning of that is you have one body of the people and two heads. The two heads just simply symbolize two different aspects of human society, the spiritual and the temporal.
Oh, so he moved because his wife is Moroccan. That's why. That's why he moved.
Because it's the same body, but they have two different spheres or roles. This actually comes out of the Old Testament. If you look at the Old Testament, there's a clear delineated spheres of authority to where, for example, you can't, Saul in one case is castigated because Saul tries to do priestly functions. And within the Mosaic Law, he has this clear delineation that there's a difference between the laws of kings. Again, Moses had a little book about laws of kings from the Torah, and then principles that govern the Levitical priesthood. That principle was then adopted. I'm not saying the Levitical laws themselves, but the principle was adopted when society became Christianized. There were some groups in the 1st and 2nd century who were not the most educated Christians who thought that it was the end of the world. Jesus was going to immediately come back. And so they didn't think under this time of persecution that they would be put in a situation where they would apply biblical principles and then later canonical canon law principles.
Someone said, of course, the white Muslim is the only one moving out of the West. Yeah, it's because most of these guys are staying in our nations. Like, even if Jake is the exception, like, most of these Muslims are coming to our nations because they know subconsciously that they are superior cultures. That's why they're freaking leaving.
law principles to society. Once the Imperium became Christianized, it's only natural that they would apply those. But here's the thing. The New Testament is not unclear about that. And if you've got over 1,000 years of unanimity between East and West, even if they disagree theologically, they still agree on this principle all the way up until perhaps the 1800s is really when this begins to be questioned. So where's that lack of clarity for those for that millennium plus?
Okay, so what I see is that in the early period, as you said, there wasn't consensus on the correct view of the church and state. And then in the latter portion, we also have this confusion. But then we have a middle period, which I agree, in the Roman West and in the East, you do have an agreed upon standard in which Christians seem to be agreeing that, no, there is this symphonia and there is this involvement in the state from the church. I agree with that. But what I'm saying is, in Islam, you don't have that. You can disagree with the laws, you can disagree with whatever else, the application of it. But we see very early on that Islam is political. There were many disputes and debates, even theologically in early Islam, but this wasn't really one of them. There was debate over who should be the political leader, sure, but there wasn't debate over there being political leaders and them fundamentally instituting Islamic law. You see that all the way up to the current day. Now, of course, as you rightly said, that this sort of secular liberalism has also hit Muslim lands, and sure, there
is he able to provide any post-Nicene source of Christians debating that? And honestly, you actually do have debate between Muslims now in America over whether or not they should be politicians. I actually just did I didn't just do a stream. I did the stream like a month ago because there's all these Muslims saying that they should basically not enter into politics in America because America is a Christian nation and they should respect that. So actually there is debate over whether or not Muslims should get into politics, just like there is in Christianity. Now, historically, was there debate? No, but there also wasn't in Christianity. Not in the post-Nicene era. Everybody agreed that as Christians, we should be in politics. That's obvious because we're building God's church. We're building the church on earth as it is in heaven. We're building the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven.
There are problems there, but I don't think it is nearly as bad as it is in the West, and I think it's because Muslims have a much more foundational understanding of the relationship between Islamic law and society, where that's really, to be honest, I think it's lacking in, if you're correct about the correct view of how Christianity sees church and state, then you should be doing a lot more lectures on this because it seems that most Americans and most supposed Christians in the West don't view it this way. They don't view it this way really at all, and that's why you have people like Michael Jones.
I mean, the whole problem with the Dispy Zionists is that they do think that their Christianity is political, and they have terrible theology, and it bleeds into their geopolitics because they believe this so deeply. So Catholics believe this, Orthodox believe this, and most of the Protestants believe this, that we should be involved in politics, that our theology does have impact on politics. So it's not even true. What he's saying is literally not even true.
Not criticize him, but Trent Horn and even Catholics, where the Catholics previously, or the Roman West, would have agreed with the East and kind of your view of government and structure, where today you don't really see that. There aren't too many Catholics who believe that, other than maybe some tradcads. Not too many Protestants who believe that, and then it's just a small amount of Dyerites, to be honest.
Also not true. Also not true that the Protestants don't believe it. I just refuted that.
Is Trent still here, by the way? Did Trent leave? Oh. I was going to say a cuss word to make him leave.
Trent Horn was here before? Yeah. Because I saw a guy that was wearing a Trent Horn badge, but it didn't look like Trent Horn. It was weird.
That was his imposter body double. So he didn't want to get assassinated, so he has a hired body double in case, like, if he's around me. So no, I'm joking. Well, so you said, one thing I want to highlight, that's not the main point, but you said there wasn't a consensus. But who do you mean in the first 3 centuries when the church is being persecuted? Why would there be a consensus when you admitted that the correct position could still be there in a period when it's debated? I mean, Islam is full of non-consensus and debates. So yeah. Who are you talking about when there's not a consensus? You just mean the first 3 centuries?
Yeah, I'm just talking about the early period. And I agree that just because there wasn't a consensus doesn't mean that your representation or your position is incorrect. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it appears that it's not as clear in early Christianity as it is in Islam. As you said, there were theological debates, for example, is the Quran created or not. I'm not trying to waste time. But there wasn't a debate, and there were debates about who should be the ruler politically in Islam. And that's why we have a division between Sunni and Shia. But there was no debate about whether or not Islam should be political in that way. That's what I was trying to say.
Okay, but I mean, in the case of Nicaea, for example, if there's debate and Nicaea settles a dispute and the canons note that you can be a Christian and a soldier, then how is that a problem for my position because something's debated for a period? I just don't understand
the argument that I'm making, and it doesn't follow necessarily, I'm not arguing that, but I think it counts as evidence against the position, is that it seems that because there is this and not a small difference, I would say a wide difference for several hundred years. And then you also have that taking place again today, where your position, I mean, I'll ask you this. Do you think that your position is a minority view held amongst Christians today?
Someone brought up St. John Chrysostom's sermon. I don't know what sermon you're talking about, but my followers already know this. You guys should head over to undergroundcanon.com. Guys, I have a treat for you here. Homilies Against the Jews by St. John Chrysostom is actually now available in hard copy. So you can head over to undergroundcanon.com/Ben and then use code Ben when you check out. So pick up a copy. I think it's on pre-order right now, unless he already got some more in. If he already got some more in, then you can get this right now. These keep selling out within like 24 hours. By the way, it was like a boomer who published this. That's why it's got the stupid AI cover. But otherwise, you can literally get this in hard copy finally. Use code Ben at the discount or at the checkout for a discount. Again, it's undergroundcanon.com. I dropped the link in the chat. So if you want to pick up St. John Chrysostom and that goated text.
Well, if you use the term Christian broadly.
In a broad way. Yeah, I'm
sure.
saying including people who call themselves Orthodox, Catholic.
I don't know why Jay granted that. That's not even true.
Protestant.
Yes.
I know you would agree. You would probably say some of these guys are phonies. I understand. But I'm saying, and people who identify as Christian today, wouldn't you agree that your position is a minority and most people don't believe in that who call themselves Christian?
Yes, but in terms of the prompt of the debate, in terms of how this would prove which is better for society, it only really betters.
Someone said this is a funny comment because on my stream on Tuesday, I literally said on Tuesday that I went over the thread of all the heretical things that popes have said about the Jews. So you guys can check out my stream on Tuesday because I went over this exact topic.
If the Islamic position actually has the good for society.
Yeah, please like the live,
if
guys.
It's correct that the church's focus is not primarily political, it just simply doesn't follow from that it has nothing to say about the political. So if the argument is that the Bible gives rise to the revolutions of Protestantism or something like that, I just simply think that's a correlation without causation in the sense that, so because the Bible existed and Jake's understanding that the Bible's New Testament is more Protestant in its view of church and state, I think you have to demonstrate that first. I don't think you could demonstrate that. And the fact that in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, some people disputed that, it simply just doesn't follow that there is no Christian doctrine of the state. So again, it's not that strong of an argument.
Thanks for the super chats, guys. As always, I'll go over all super chats at the end.
If the same flaws apply to, and by the way, so the fact that Islam does believe, quote, in a theocracy, has that actually successfully always been applied throughout the centuries of Islamic history? Just think about terms like the way that the legal rulings in fiqh and whatnot in your system are applied. I mean, it's not always consistently applied, is it?
No.
Okay, so the idea that the consistent application somehow necessarily proves or shows that your position is better, I just simply think doesn't follow.
The original question I asked, and that's what I'm inviting you to do, and maybe I'm just missing it. So I have my own thesis about why this happened. I explained it, and you're saying, well, it's a correlation, but not necessarily causation. I understand that. So that's why I'm inviting you to explain, and maybe I'm missing it, what was the clear causation of, forget about the first 300 years. I understand what you're saying there. But what was exactly the clear causation from where the Roman West, the Catholics, and the East, even after they separated, had this agreement, and now it's like, and I'm not saying this to be funny, I'm just saying in reality, now it's just Jay Dyer and his crew and some Orthodox who believe this, and pretty much everybody else
this is
has
just
gone by
not
the
true.
wayside. It seems like a really sharp decline that happened very quickly. Now, I gave my reasoning or historical...
Basically, all Orthodox and Catholics in like the ethnic countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, believe this. So all of the Orthodox and Catholics in like the ethnically Orthodox and ethnically Catholic nations believe this, at least the ones that are actually practicing. And then all of the Zionist Protestants believe this. That's why they're Zionist. So this is literally not true.
Kind of argument of why I think this happened. Now, you don't believe it's the Bible's fault. You don't believe it's the New Testament fault. So that's why I'm kind of inviting you to explain the causation.
So if we set aside that early issue, then I would say if you look at the 11th century, there's a huge revolution that even Roman Catholic scholars would admit. You have people like Congar and Dvornik, the famous Unionist scholar. They admit that there's a revolution in ecclesiology in the West. It's known as the Gregorian Reforms. And what's unique about this is that the papacy began to take on a new geopolitical role. I think that we can try to be charitable and fair as fair as we can to the Roman Catholics of that period. I'm not blaming every Roman Catholic of that time period. I think that the schism began in 1054 and then sort of flourished, it grew apart over time. But it's unanimously nowadays admitted, even amongst Catholic scholars, that this period is a revolution in ecclesiology. Now, that might sound abstract and not like a huge deal, but the reason that matters is that prior to that, canon law in the East and the West forbade the church from being the state. So we're not saying that the church has no thing to say to the state or that the church doesn't work in Symphonia. Again, that was the norm even prior to the 11th century. But when you have the papacy saying, I am now a geopolitical power. I am now going to take the sword. The papacy begins to have standing armies. They begin to have warrior monks, monastic orders that have the sword. Again, in the Byzantine model, the sword isn't bad. It's exercised, as Romans 13 says, the imperium has the diakonos. That's the same word as deacon in Romans 13. So Paul is calling the emperor a deacon. That means he has a quasi-religious role. So even in the New Testament, the idea of Romans 13 is not a radical separation of church and state. That's a Roger Williams Baptist idea, very, very late. So 11th century is a key move to where the papacy takes on geopolitical world power. That begins a process, in my view, that culminates in a Reformation rejection of some of those papal excesses. And most of the reformers, as we all know, Protestantism is protesting the papal Roman Catholic system. So not everything in the papal Roman Catholic system is wrong, but what they are protesting is, in some cases, the overstepping, particularly in the political realm. If you look at Western European history, the German princes, other princes, they did not like the papacy stepping into the temporal sphere. They resented that. So the Reformation was partly a rejection of that. So if you want the long sort of causal chain, which I do think is there, you could say, yeah, there's a long series of revolutions that begins with Gregorian reforms in the 11th century. And by the way, many of those popes in the 11th century, I want to say the majority of them actually for 70 years, were actually appointed by German kings. So it's nepotism. That set the stage for down the road what would become the Reformation. So yeah, I do think you could trace it this way, and then past that, if you want to get up into like the Bolsheviks and all that, I mean, that's all Western banking money that was funding all of that. So that's the long of it, but none of that has anything to do with whether the position was actually in the New Testament.
Okay. You mentioned about warrior monks and stuff like that. I know, obviously, it did exist. But what do you make of my citation of Basil's canon that specifically mentions that even if the war is quote-unquote justified, that people who come back from that are not actually to partake in communion for 3 years? So you have a case in which it's supposedly legitimate, and yet in St. Basil's canon, it explicitly says that they're not clean in the sense that they can't take communion.
Yeah, so again, just like with King...
That was part of, sorry to cut you, but that was part of canon, that was instituted as canon law.
Right, so the way canon law functions in Orthodox Church, you can look at the canons of Trullo. One of the very last canon of Trullo in the Orthodox Church says that the application of these principles is up to the prerogatives of the bishop. So for us, the local bishop is the applier of that. That doesn't mean that it's do whatever you want, but that he does have the final say-so, because for us, there's not really a higher authority than that. So for us, that type of application would be applied... First of all, on a case-by-case basis. So it is possible that a person doesn't have to be under the canonical penalty of 3 years. But the principle is there because, as we said, even King David in the Old Testament was a righteous warrior whom God taught how to fight. Because he had shed so much blood, there were certain things that were not appropriate for him. So it's a canonical penalty that has nothing to do with saying you're not saved.
I want to show this this excerpt here this is again from the Russian Synod of 2000. And this particular, so this is at the beginning of this document, by the way, it literally says that this is the official teaching of the Russian Patriarchate. So this is literally the official teaching of the Russian Orthodox Church. And it says this: among saints venerated by the Orthodox Church, many became famous for the love of their earthly homeland and faithfulness to it. Russian sources praise the Holy Prince Michael of Vir, who gave his life for his fatherland, comparing his feat to martyrdom of holy protomartyr Demetrius of Thessaloniki. The good lover of his fatherland says this about his native city of Thessaloniki: O Lord, if you ruin this city, I will perish together with it. But if you save it, I will also be saved. In all times, the church has called upon her children to love their homeland on earth and not to spare their lives to protect if it was threatened. The Russian Orthodox Church on many occasions gave her blessing to the people or them to take part in liberation wars. Thus, in 1380, the Venerable Sergius, the abbot and miracle maker, blessed the Russian troops headed by the Holy Prince Dmitri before their battle with the Tatar Mongol invaders. And basically, it gives all these examples of all these Russian saints who defended their fatherland. I love this quote from St. John of Kronstadt. The Holy Righteous Kronstadt wrote this about the love of one's earthly homeland. Love the earthly homeland. It was raised, distinguished, honored, and equipped you with everything. Have special love for the heavenly homeland. That homeland is incomparably more precious than this one because it is holy, righteous, and incorruptible. The priceless blood of the Son of God has earned that homeland for you, but in order to be members of that homeland, you should respect and love its laws, just as you are obliged to respect and really respect the laws of your earthly homeland. Guys, there's so many good things. There are so many good things in this text. The universal nature of the church, however, does not mean that Christians should have no right to national identity and national self-expressions. On the contrary, the church unites in herself the universal with the national. Thus, the Orthodox Church, though universal, consists of many autocephalous national churches, Orthodox Christians aware of being citizens of the heavenly homeland should not forget about their earthly homeland. So this this notion that this is like not a prevalent topic in Christianity, Jake, when this is the official teaching of the Russian Patriarchate?
It's just saying, out of reverence for the sacrament, we're going to impose a time where you do penance, because most of the time, even if you're just in the war, in the battle, you've still probably sinned in some way in our perspective. So it's simply a sort of a penance that's restorative. It has nothing to do with saying like you're excommunicated from the church. It's not like that at all.
Yeah, I'm not saying that, but okay, I guess you kind of answered at the end that you would agree. I mean, I don't have this position, but for you and the way you see this canon law, which comes from Basil, is that inevitably in war, there's going to be sins committed, even if it's supposed to be a just war. And therefore, because of that, I mean, do you still see that as justified today? Is that something that you would agree should be reinstated if there was such a monarchy, that would be something to reinstate?
And again, these penalties are not applied by the monarch. These are penalties applied by the church. So the church applies the canons at the local setting. So all the monarch's job is to enforce what the New Testament, not just in Romans 13, but for example, Paul says to Timothy that the state has the job, the duty.
Yeah, I've done so many streams on Galatians 3:28. St. Augustine's quote on it is excellent. If you read St. Augustine's commentary on Galatians 3:28, he explains, right, that these qualities still remain. Guys, the easiest way to refute these guys on Galatians 3:28 and their interpretation of it is just like point out, it also says there's no male or female, right? So it says there's no male or female, but everybody agrees that there still are real categories of gender, right? Only the transgender, whack jobs, right, are the ones that are saying that's not the case. So how can it be that St. Paul is actually saying these categories they cease to exist? He's clearly not saying that.
To punish evildoers, and then he lists a series of offenses that are particularly egregious, such as murder, etc. So the state's role is not to enforce church code. Even the Roman Catholic West had a distinction between the penalties that the church would give. And so, for example, even when there were heretic laws in the medieval West, the Inquisition would hand those people over to the state. They typically, except for the Spanish Inquisition, which was under Isabella, it was separate from the Papal Inquisition. You hand it over to the state. So in the same case with St. Justinian, like the church might make a ruling. For example, Basil has a canon about abortion. The church doesn't say, like, you're sentenced to death. It's handed over to the state, and then the king makes that decision. And we simply see that as modeled with Solomon. When Solomon has the two hoes, and he, does that wise thing where he tests the hose, and then he says, okay, now we know who the real mom is, right? So he's applying the principle of the law to the 304s and the thoughts. T-H-O-T, that's an Old Testament thought. Anyway, that's a thought exercise right there.
Yeah,
I'll be here all week.
Yeah. So let me get, because you didn't respond to this, but I mentioned a lot, so it's fine. I mentioned Luke chapter 12 in the scenario where a man brings an issue of inheritance, and Jesus answers, man, who made me a judge or an arbiter over you? Why, if Jesus is supposed to be the head of the church, right, and you see that, or as you're claiming, the church is not supposed to be completely apolitical, why would Jesus respond in this way?
Great question, in fact, and a lot of Protestants would bring up that same passage. So for us, first of all, in Jesus' first coming, in his, quote, humiliation, we see the ministry that he's doing as specifically fulfilling the role of the humble servant. But even in the Old Testament, that would not be something that you would only take that kind of a ruling to the state. So in his first coming, he is specifically not in any role of state. In the exaltation and ascension, we think that when he ascended, he then became King of Kings. Thus, monarchy continues on, even via the book of Revelation, calling him King of Kings. So all earthly kings are underneath the supreme king. So it wouldn't be sensible. And it's the same with the woman in adultery. We believe Jesus is the one that gave those Old Testament laws. I know you know that we believe that, but I'm saying that for the audience, right? So it's not a different God of the Old Testament or something like that. So Jesus is the one that laid down those penalties. And certainly as the supreme judge, he has the authority to abrogate or to relax the penalty. But there's several cases in the New Testament where people come to Jesus with legal matters or personal vengeance matters, and he simply says, that's not what my mission is at this point. But that does not mean, and let's take one example. In Matthew 5, when he talks about, if somebody slaps you, give them the other cheek, right? And this is oftentimes cited as, we're supposed to be pacifists. We don't read the Bible in isolation from the rest of the passages, right? This is talking about personal vengeance.
We also recognize that the Bible should be interpreted through the lens of the entire witness of the church, right? Like, Jake, you do not have the authority to interpret the Bible, bro. The church has the authority to interpret the Bible, not you. So that's another factor here, is these people will weaponize the Bible in such a way that disconnects it from the witness of the church, which predated the Bible, right? That's why it is a higher authority, in a sense, right? Now, obviously, from a revelation standpoint, now that we have the full scriptures, right, of course it is along with Holy Tradition as the highest authority, right? But the church is the interpreter of it. It's kind of like the Constitution and the Supreme Court, right? The Supreme Court is the one who actually enforces and interprets actively the Constitution, right? So to pit them against each other doesn't really make any sense. Now, the Supreme Court's not infallible like the church is, so it's a little bit different, but you guys understand the analogy.
It has nothing to do with saying that you can't have, righteous judgment in a law court, because there's many places where the New Testament gives principles for judges and for rulers. The book of Proverbs, which is always used by the early church, it was, according to St. Athanasius, the catechism for converts, including the Deuterocanon. It's full of principles of justice in weights and balances. That's money. Principles of kings and judges, that they shouldn't take bribes. Those are all statements to rulers in the political realm, in the polis. It's just simply not what Jesus' focus was in his 3 years of ministry, which was about accomplishing what the Father had set him out to do.
Okay, so it seems like, to kind of summarize, you're saying that was not Jesus' initial earthly ministry.
Correct.
Was not to be, a political figure or to be instituting, these specific laws in that way. Okay, so I mean, maybe that's where you're trying to say that Protestantism, or the eventual outgrowth of complete separation between church and state, is due to a misunderstanding of applying Jesus' initial earthly
Which we already refuted his
initial
interpretation of that, by the way.
Campaign and what he was supposed to be doing, to later after the ascension and going forward. Is that correct?
Yeah, so like in the Old Testament, you have many places, again, like where there's prophecies that the kings of the nations and the Gentiles would convert. You have, Psalm 45, which is about, in our view, Jesus and Mary, but we also think it's about kings and magistrates converting. So there's laws for magistrates, and even those penal sanctions at times you can see throughout Byzantine code. Like, I'm not saying that they're being Judaizers and like copy pasting, but they're using the principles of the Old Testament penal sanctions and the Mosaic law, and even applying those in a social setting. So it's only natural that when Christian societies become predominantly Christian, that they would function that way. And I just don't see why none of that demonstrates that it's unclear in the New Testament.
Okay, is there any Christian monarchy today, or theocracy?
Not that I'm aware of, other than nominally.
Okay, and
I mean, there are monarchs, but they're nominally.
Okay, now, when I quoted you from a video where you discussed this topic in detail, as attempting to reinstitute it, and you kind of mentioned it in your opening statement, I don't mean making society exactly what the Byzantine Empire was like. I'm not saying that, but how do you envision anything coming remotely close to that, given the situation that we're in? And I think it is related to the question of the debate, because we're talking a lot about theory here and kind of what the principles are of Christianity as you see it in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But in terms of practical application, it seems to be really lacking. You're representing, I'm not saying it's an incorrect view. I mean, I've tried to argue for that, but you're representing a view which you're admitting is held by a minority of quote-unquote Christians today. So even if you're correct, it seems like there's no genuine practical application of that anyway. So how does that really help society if it's never being instituted, or it's not for several hundred years?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I think if you look at, as we mentioned in last night's debate, right, if I was Isaiah and it was, I was being taken into Babylonian captivity, and I'd been given these prophecies that from our perspective are predicting the conversion of the Gentile nations to worship the God of Israel, to worship Yahweh, that would seem totally impossible. How could that ever be? If you look at the first century when Jesus is doing his ministry, right, in the book of John, he says, if I be lifted up, I will draw all nations unto myself. I mean, Christianity is a tiny sect. This seems absolutely outlandish and impossible. In Magnificat and Luke, the Theotokos, St. Mary says, all generations henceforth will call me blessed. These are pretty profound prophecies. And again, at that time, that would seem preposterous. How would all the nations call this random virgin in Israel blessed? That seems crazy. And yet, here we are 2,000 years later, and many, many millions, perhaps billions of people have called her blessed. So even the latest scholars dating those texts would still date it within the time frame when the church was a tiny minority being persecuted. My point in all that is just simply to say that just because something is not the present dominant idea has nothing to do with whether it could be. And when you look at the way that the first 3 centuries of the church eventually took over the Roman Empire, it wasn't with swords, it was with the blood of the martyrs. That's what actually converted Byzantium, or made Byzantium what it is.
And then literally as soon as the persecution stopped, we were able to organize into a monarchy. And so to use, again, those 2 quotes he has from Tertullian and then the anonymous author to try to say that wasn't the point of Christianity early on is just utter nonsense given the context of what was occurring during that time. You can't have national identity during that time because they're trying to kill you.
Same way, just because at this present moment there's not explicitly Christian states. And by the way, it doesn't necessarily have to be a monarchy. It's just simply that in the history of the church, what we have is the imperium as the norm. So we would argue that it is an emperor, it is an imperium, and it is kings and queens, the one in many relationship in that sort of Byzantine model that is the ideal. Is it possible to have a Christian republic? It's possible, perhaps. There have been theologians that have argued it's possible. It hasn't existed really yet. But again, I don't have to prove that right now my position has to be dominant if in the first 3 centuries it took over, and perhaps the internet will...
Thanks, guys, for the Super Chats. I'm about to run out of room on Super Chats, so I might have to go over them before the end. So if I get one more, then I'll go over them right away.
Bring Orthodox Christianity. It's bringing millions of people, into the church. I think in the next 10 years, we've already seen tens of thousands just this year.
So I think more Dyerites, right?
Well, again, Orthodox Christianity isn't Dyerites, but I'm just simply saying that we don't know. If 3 centuries conquered the Roman Empire and those prophecies were fulfilled, there's no reason why. And some of even the most anti-Christian global elites actually write in their text that they are concerned of a rise of Christian theocracy. So again, the fact that, but none of that has anything to do with proving that Islam is better for society.
Correct. But what my basic proposal throughout my opening statement.
Yeah, I low-key feel like this debate got kind of dragged into a area that is kind of retarded. So basically Jake is saying that, basically what I hear him is he's making 2 claims. He's saying that monarchy is disconnected from the ante-Nicene era and the teachings of Christ, and also modern Christians aren't monarchs. Those are basically his 2 arguments as to why Christian societies are inferior. That doesn't follow from either of those. So why are we even talking about this? How about we actually compare Morocco to Spain? How about that? Let's compare Morocco to Spain there, Jake. Since you love Morocco and you decided to move there because of your Moroccan wife, supposedly. How about we talk about that? He won't want to talk about that because he'll get buried.
Questioning is that if one religion is going to be better for society, it has to have a political view, a political perspective. Obviously, I've tried to argue that I don't think that Christianity has an explicit enough political doctrine, and that's why we see in the early period where there's some disagreement.
And even if that were true, it still wouldn't follow. It still wouldn't follow that that Christian societies are inferior to Muslim societies. That still doesn't follow from that point. Even if you grant that the New Testament is not clear enough on its prescription, which we recognize, by the way, that the Old Testament is actually the prescription because that's the prescription of what a nation is in that same Russian document I showed you guys earlier, right? But that still doesn't follow because the modern Christian nations still mog, the Protestant nations still mog your stupid Muslim shitholes.
As you said, and then today where pretty much nobody believes in it, and then we have a period which, whatever.
But that would just be appeal to masses. So what if, none of those things prove that there isn't that teaching just because a lot of people don't believe it or know it.
No, but I'm saying to you that I think it stands to reason that if it's so, if the positions regarding it are so diverse in the early period and the late period, I don't think it's merely because of what you stated earlier. I think that there is a lack of clarity in the New Testament. I think that even Jesus' earthly ministry, as you said, in the way that you're interpreting it, he was not a political figure in that way.
But when Jesus is ministering, right,
yeah.
The apostles' epistles, for example, have not been written. Okay, so to take an instance and say, well, in this case, because Jesus didn't give a legal ruling, therefore the New Testament doesn't have clear teachings on the rules and principles of the state. And I'm saying there's many, many passages that, from our perspective, providentially would be included in Scripture, which do consistently comment on that. And even if there's debate in the 1st and 2nd century amongst a lot of the apologists and people that end up even not being in the church, like Origen, that's really irrelevant to whether there is a doctrine of the state in the New Testament. And I've not seen how you've shown any significant evidence yet that there's not a Christian doctrine of the state.
And by the way, we had no issue, again, like Jay pointed out, we pretty much had universal agreement on this, even up until even the Protestant nations that Jake is referencing. We already refuted, he's going to use America as the token example of what he's talking about, basically the separation of church and state, which we already refuted this, that it really wasn't until the 20th century that you see them falling away from this sort of Christianized nation, right? So I don't even none of his arguments follow, and this notion that the Old Testament is not clear enough when every single Christian advocated for a Christianized nation, at least from the post-Nicene era all the way up until literally the modern era after World War II, basically. Maybe up until the beginnings of the 20th century, if you're being really generous.
I can keep going with more passages that demonstrate.
Okay, so what do you think is and it's not built upon one, if you want to give 2 or 3, that's fine. What do you think are the clearest passages in the New Testament specifically, not the Old Testament, in the New Testament specifically that support your position?
You got to go the Our Father, man.
Well, the first most obvious one would be Romans 13, where, as I said, Paul specifically calls, and note this is at the time when it's a persecuting pagan emperor. This is Nero, who absolutely hates the church. And Paul still calls Nero, much like you see in the book of Daniel with the way Daniel treats Nebuchadnezzar, Paul still calls him a diakonos, a providential ordained ruler of God. So that means that there's a duty, and his duty specifically is outlined there in Romans 13, to punish evildoers with the sword, and that is the death penalty. I don't think any exegetes, even if they're liberals, would disagree that that's what Paul thought it meant. And then if we look at, for example, Romans 1 and 2, there's very similar principles there, that even the natural law teaches us that the state has this role. He says explicitly to Timothy that the law exists, and that's, of course, enforced by the ruler, the king. The law exists to punish, and then he lists a series of sins that are particularly egregious. And again, the assumption is there in Romans 1, Romans 13, and in the passage to Timothy, those are particularly egregious and perhaps even capital offenses. So these are just 3 off of the cuff. There are many more, and like I said, it was normative, even in Athanasius and St. Alexander's day. This is like the year 300. It was normative for every catechumen to come into the church to read the Deuterocanon and to read Proverbs. Now, I know a lot of Protestants might not be familiar with the Deuterocanonical text, but the Deuterocanonical texts have tons of
and the Shepherd of
information
Hermas, by the way. The Protestants love to cite St. Athanasius for their canon, not realizing that he says that the catechumens should read the Shepherd of Hermas.
Kings, magistrates, judges, rulers. For example, the book of Sirach, again, what St. Athanasius has every catechumen reading. It's full of practical advice and practical principles that relate to all the things that we're talking about. Simply reading the book of Sirach alone, as St. Athanasius mandates all of the converts to do, would actually answer every one of these qualms. That's just Sirach.
So you first mentioned Romans 13, and it seems to be advocating for submission to Nero, right? So I don't understand how this supports your position, because it seems like it's an example of the apostles making peace with a pagan state, which would basically be my argument, not yours.
No, so again, if you look at Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar is a pagan. And the whole purpose and point of the book of Daniel is that eventually Nebuchadnezzar is humbled and he converts to believe in some sense in the one true God. But that doesn't mean that it's the job of Daniel to revolt or overthrow him, right? Obviously, he's in a situation where they're taken into captivity. And so the recognition is that even though he's a pagan, there's a providential
That's a good point
role.
too, by the way, guys. There's an aspect of monarchy. One of the main problems with democracy is that it actually tries to essentially take matters into man's hands, right? It's basically an attempt at control, whereas monarchy is a recognition of the divinely appointed aspects of a political leader, right? Because a monarch really ultimately is appointed by God, right? A monarch really ultimately is appointed by God. All right, I got another super chat, so I got to go over these. Otherwise, I run out of room on my little thing here. So, okay, thank you, Solarius, for the super chat. Are any Muslim apologists you believe are good faith, competent? I would say Jake is one of the most good faith. Again, like he has literally, I mean, he criticized Libiano. He said Libiano got shredded by Jay and basically was lying using ChatGPT and these things. I would say Jake's the closest thing to a genuine one, to be honest. Like I would debate with Jake. Stefan, welcome. Thank you for the super chat, including the Mets. We finally got goy ball season coming up, by the way. Goy ball starting here in a couple weeks. Resident Indian says, thank you for the super chat. Evangelical, I was talking to you, said Paul corrupted Jesus Christ's gospel. Muslim two arguments, even in Christian circles. Yikes. Cringe. That's why you need the church, bro. That's why you need the church to interpret. Resident Indian says, again, when you get away from church authority, it leads to a vacuum that gets filled by incomplete ideals. Yes, very true. Exactly what you were just saying. Evangelicals will go the founding fathers as if they're infallible, but will never go to the church fathers. Yeah, this was like, I didn't even know who the church fathers were when I was Protestant, bro. Like, I didn't even know who they were. And you have a lot of Protestants actually reading, church fathers now, right? Because they're trying to weaponize them. Guys, you want to know how funny it is? Thank you for the super chat, Orthodox. As always, thank you for the super chat. You guys want to know how funny it is that Protestants will try to cite church fathers? They will literally try to say the church fathers taught like sola fide. They'll be like, oh yeah, St. John Chrysostom, look, he's talking about faith alone. Guys, St. John Chrysostom has one of the most detailed explanations of the sacrament of confession and absolution, which Protestants believe is a violation of sola fide. So, and by the way, these guys are all bishops. Protestants don't have bishops unless they're Lutheran or Anglican, right? They don't have bishops. So they're citing bishops who they don't even have in their church, who believe in the sacraments, which they also don't have in their church, to try to say that they believed in Protestant ideals. Do you know how retarded that sounds? Do you know how freaking retarded that sounds? Thank you, Righteous Draft. Although I cannot say I agree with the super chat because I am a Packer fan, not a Viking fan, even though I am originally from Minnesota. My parents are from Wisconsin, so I'm a Packer fan. That's how I was raised. So go Pack, go. We're winning the Super Bowl this year, guys. I'm definitely not coping.
that he serves. So Paul is talking about Romans 13, the providential duty that any ruler or head of state has to God. Now, whether those people follow those duties or whether they're wicked, that's a different question because they're providentially there. So our perspective is that, and this is why there's so many martyrs, we don't worship Nero. We can allow Nero to be the providentially ordained ruler. That doesn't mean that God doesn't want Nero to follow Christian principles, but whether he does is a different question. And that's a separate question from when there is a Christian king, he has even more of an obligation and duty to follow the biblical principles.
Is there such thing as righteous rebellion against people like Nero? Is that possible in the Orthodox Church?
So this is a different question. In terms of like, could there be situations where case by case basis you could have?
Personally, I'd say yes as a last resort. Sort of like revolution in the Orthodox paradigm is seen as a absolute last resort. Like if you absolutely have to, then you can overthrow a corrupt monarch.
Civilizational struggle, something like that. And there is in the Byzantine history situations where there could be legitimate revolution. But that's a separate question from whether or not the New Testament teaches that we are supposed to. For example, the New Testament is there to confirm the fulfillment of the prophecies of Christ. But again, the reason I went to Syriac is that it's not the mindset, even of the first, second, third century church, because they were all using the Deuterocanonical text. It's not our mindset that we only look into the New Testament to see, are there verses that give a list of legal principles? There's actually are some. But I'm saying that the catechumens are not just reading the New Testament because they don't even necessarily have an entire New Testament. They're also reading the book of Syriac, which is literally full of every aspect of society. It's like 60 plus chapters, all aspects of society being covered.
Really the entire Old Testament, right? This is what Israel was. Israel is the prescription of what a nation is. And guess what? You have what we would say were Trinitarians, right? That were leading the nation, right? They were serving the one true God and his Son and Spirit, right? Who they know from the theophanies, and then the Spirit who dwells, right, in the temple. So they knew the triune God and they served him, and they were the leaders of the nation, which is a prescription for our societies and our nations. And no, Des did not catch it. Des did not catch it, bro. Take it up with the NFL rules. Sorry, bro.
Even magistrates, judges, rulers, kings. The book of Proverbs has dozens of proverbs about kings. So all of those would be being read. And so the argument seems to hinge on everybody just reading the Gospels and then coming up with a vague notion of the state. That's not true.
Well, it seems to me in this case and in other passages that...
Okay, one more point on that. Actually, the Deuterocanon is a great point here because to the point of the Reformation, because the Reformation doesn't believe in the Deuterocanon, they didn't have that for catechumens, you're actually leaving out a gigantic portion of the book of Sirach, which would be about Christian kings.
Okay. The reason why I think it's related, why I'm asking about possible rebellion, is because if you have this idea of the church being involved in political affairs and submitting to the ruler, is there supposed to be submission to the ruler in this case, even if he's a pagan? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Okay, so
if the Christian laws are supposed to be instituted, why would Christians be required? It seems like they're required actually not to rebel, to render unto Caesar, to just basically submit to the authority, whether they're Christian and instituting Christian values or not.
So basically, the church, again, in the first, second, third century, when they're in the catacombs being persecuted, they have the same attitude as.
Hey guys, we're back. We should be back now. Come on. We should be back. Yeah, okay. We are back. All right. I had to reset my router. I'm just going to start resetting my router before every stream at this point. Refresh the page if it's not working for you. Refresh the page if it's not working for you. We're back on my end. People are saying it's working. People are saying it's working. Guys, please like the live and get it back out there. Oh my gosh. Come on.